in Luton, Bedfordshire, United Kingdom, on the evening of Monday, May 23, 2016, a 34-year-old woman was brutally murdered inside her family home on Overstone Road. Saima Khan, a devoted mother of 4 young children, became the victim of a crime so savage that it shocked the entire community. She had been stabbed 68 times. The wounds were so vicious that her head and arm were nearly severed. From the outside, the Khan residence looked like an ordinary, modern family home, blending in with the other houses in the quiet, suburban street. But inside, officers encountered a scene of horrific carnage. Blood was everywhere, as if gallons had been splattered across the walls, stairs, and floor. This story centers on the Khan family, originally from Pakistan. Saima, the elder, was born in 1982, while her younger sister, Sabah, was born 7 years later, in 1989. The family also included 2 brothers. They spent their early years in the Netherlands, but when Saima turned 18, the entire family relocated to England in search of better opportunities. The Khan household was traditional, yet modern. They maintained strong Islamic values and pride in their heritage, while also adapting to Western life. Both sisters grew up fluent in Dutch and later mastered English after the move. They shared a deep bond. Saima, known for her kindness and gentle nature, often looked after Sabah like a second mother. Sabah adored her older sister, once saying they were one soul divided between 2 bodies. When the family settled in Luton's Overstone Road, they joined a large Pakistani community. Luton, about 30 miles north of London, has one of the largest Muslim populations in the UK, with nearly a third of residents identifying as Muslim. Here, Saima pursued her dream of helping others by studying nursing. She had a natural gift for caregiving and wanted to dedicate her life to supporting those in need. After completing her training, she began working as a home care nurse. Patients described her as reliable, warm, and compassionate, a woman who radiated calm. The Khan family lived in a 2-story brick townhouse, typical of many European neighborhoods. Each apartment in this townhouse had a separate street-level entry. Such homes are commonly found in most European cities. By the time Saima turned 21, her parents began searching for a suitable husband for her. In keeping with tradition, they reached out to extended relatives in Pakistan. Arranged marriages are common among Pakistani families in the UK, sometimes even used as a means to secure British residency or citizenship. Many of these unions end unhappily, with young women, accustomed to Western freedoms, finding themselves in restrictive or even abusive marriages. But Saima's case was different. No one pressured her. She trusted her parents' judgment and agreed willingly. Family meant everything to her. She wanted to marry and start her own. Her future husband was Hafiz Rahman, a man 3 years older than her and 10 years older than Sabah. Hafiz had lived his entire life in Pakistan and was considered by relatives to be a respectable match for Saima. Hafiz's family hoped that moving to Britain would give him more opportunities and a better life. By marrying a British resident, Hafiz would be able to secure a British passport and become a full-fledged citizen of the United Kingdom. After the wedding in Pakistan, Hafiz and Saima returned together to the United Kingdom. The newlyweds moved into the Khan family home, following the cultural custom in many Muslim households of living as one large, close-knit family. Hafiz eventually gained citizenship and found work as a taxi driver. He held firmly to traditional values, expecting his wife to bear children, raise them, care for her husband, prepare meals, and manage the household. Saima, however, never intended to give up her career entirely. She balanced her duties as a wife with her work caring for patients. Not long after their marriage, she became pregnant with their first child, a daughter. Before she could fully recover from that pregnancy, more followed in quick succession. In the end, they had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. 3 generations of the family lived together under one roof, supporting and caring for each other. In total, 11 people shared the townhouse. Hafiz, Saima, and their 4 children, Saima's parents, her 2 brothers, and her younger sister, Sabah. On the surface, life seemed to be going well, apart from the ordinary domestic disagreements that occur in any household, especially one so large. At some point, however, Sabah began to feel growing tension with her sister. The shift started after Saima's marriage to Hafiz. Once she became a wife and mother, Saima's priorities naturally changed. To Sabah, it felt like her sister no longer made time for her, focusing instead on her husband and children. Over time, Sabah grew weary of living in her older sister's shadow. Within this crowded household, a secret began to take shape. Known only to 2 people, Sabah had fallen in love with her sister's husband, Hafiz. Shockingly, he reciprocated despite the 10-year age gap, despite the taboo of Sabah being his wife's younger sister, and despite the fact that they all lived together under one roof. The 2 embarked on a passionate affair. Their attraction quickly consumed them both. It started innocently enough, fleeting glances, playful teasing, the rush of a forbidden thrill. Hafiz, more experienced, recognized what lay behind the young girl's looks. In truth, he exploited her immaturity and naivety. The affair began shortly after the birth of Saima's first child. Exhausted and fully absorbed in caring for her newborn daughter, Saima didn't notice the way her younger sister was looking at her husband. At the time, the sisters still had a fairly warm relationship. Sabah even helped look after the baby, playing the role of a loving aunt, while secretly melting into the arms of her sister's husband. Whenever no one was watching, the secret relationship carried on for years. It would occasionally end, only to resume with even greater intensity as time passed. Sabah became increasingly obsessed with Hafiz. They relied on WhatsApp to communicate, the only way to conceal their affair within a household filled with family members. With each passing wave of passion, the relationship grew more volatile as jealousy of her sister deepened. She was consumed with rage whenever she saw Hafiz giving Saima attention. She complained bitterly that he could message her day and night, yet could never find enough time to be alone with her. The affair was dangerously complicated. The tight-knit family, all living under one roof, turned the house into a pressure cooker, a volcano on the verge of erupting. And though the affair unfolded right under their noses, no one seemed to notice. Or perhaps they simply chose to look away, pretending nothing was wrong. Most likely, the relatives simply thought any possibility of an affair between Sabah and Hafiz was unthinkable. Their upbringing and faith didn't even allow them to imagine such a thing. Saima herself paid no attention to the strange glances between her husband and younger sister. She was a devoted mother of 4, juggling childcare with part-time caregiving work, exhausted and overburdened. She had neither the time nor the energy to keep watch over her husband, and she certainly never suspected such a betrayal from her own sister, whom she had loved, cared for since childhood. Meanwhile, Hafiz and Sabah would steal moments together whenever Saima was away. Sometimes they used the taxi Hafiz drove for work. Other times, they met in the family's marital bedroom. At that point, the children were 7, 4, 2, and 1 years old. Since Sabah often stayed home to help care for them, her presence in the bedroom didn't raise suspicion. Hafiz, with the flexibility of his taxi shifts, deliberately arranged his time off to coincide with his wife's working hours. Though their affair carried on for years, Hafiz still put his wife first. This infuriated Sabah. At one point, Hafiz even considered marrying Sabah as a second wife. But when he consulted a local imam, he was told it was forbidden in Islam to marry two sisters at the same time. So Hafiz abandoned the idea and continued meeting Sabah in secret. For him, she became the ultimate forbidden fruit, young, naive, and forbidden by custom from having any relationship before marriage to Hafiz. This only made the affair more intoxicating. A few months into the relationship, Sabah became pregnant. Hafiz, who refused to use contraception, insisted she terminate the pregnancy to avoid scandal and keep their affair hidden. Sabah went through with the abortion, but the experience left scars. It may also have been the moment Hafiz realized that continuing an affair with his wife's younger sister was unsustainable. By February 2016, after 4 years of secret meetings, Hafiz decided to end the affair and recommit to his wife and children. He began considering moving his family into their own home, away from the crowded household, but the very thought of losing him drove Sabah into despair. She couldn't bear the idea that Hafiz had chosen his wife and children over her. That desperation soon twisted into something darker. Sabah began obsessively searching online for ways to remove her sister from the picture. In her mind, Saima was the only obstacle between herself and Hafiz. Without Saima, Sabah imagined she could step into her place, becoming his wife and raising the children as her own. Her internet searches grew more alarming. She looked up where to buy venomous snakes, studied différents poisons, researched how to hire hitmen, and even pored over an article titled 16 Steps to End Someone's Life and Not Get Caught. In March 2016, Sabah reached out to a self-proclaimed sorcerer in Pakistan who claimed he could kill through black magic. Sabah paid the so-called sorcerer more than $6,000 to place a deadly curse on Saima. When nothing happened, Sabah grew furious. She contacts the self-proclaimed wizard again, complaining that her life is getting worse. Hafiz no longer cares about her and seems completely indifferent. She begged him to hurry and finish off her sister so that Hafiz would finally be hers. But after she sent the money for this final ritual, the sorcerer disappeared. He had been nothing more than an online scammer. Sabah couldn't bear the thought of losing Hafiz forever. To her, he was her soulmate, the man for whom she had broken Islamic rules, endured an abortion, and done things most women would never dare. Worse still, her parents had started pressing the issue of marriage for her. Talks had been ongoing for months, with a potential suitor already identified, but negotiations stalled because the families couldn't agree on the terms. Even so, the pressure was immense. As much as she loved Hafiz, openly defying her parents was nearly impossible. She felt trapped, beaten down by blow after blow. To make matters worse, she had to watch her sister Saima live the life everyone envied. A devoted husband, 4 beautiful children, and what looked like the perfect marriage. By contrast, Sabah was unmarried, childless, and directionless. Resentment festered, and soon her envy turned into rage. She began to blame Saima for everything that had gone wrong in her life. Those emotions drowned out any last trace of reason. For Sabah, it felt like her sister was stealing the very life she deserved. To her twisted mind, the only solution was to remove Saima from the picture once and for all. Meanwhile, Saima and Hafiz had found a new apartment across Luton, where they planned to move with their children. The moving date was already set, May 25th, 2016. By then, Hafiz had grown colder towards Sabah, pouring more energy into repairing his marriage. In a desperate bid to win him back, Sabah sent him anguished love messages. She wrote that no force on earth could change her feelings, that her heart was bleeding for him, and that she would do anything to prove her devotion. But behind these messages lurked a darker determination. If Hafiz wouldn't come back to her willingly, she would carve her own path to a happy ending. Saba decided to take matters into her own hands. On May 21st, 2016, she went to a supermarket and bought a large knife. She knew that on the evening of May 23rd, her parents, brothers, and Hafiz would all be away at a funeral at the local mosque, mourning a recently deceased relative. Saima couldn't attend because she had caregiving duties that night. Saba was left in charge of the children, a perfect setup for the plan she had been plotting. That night, once the children were asleep upstairs, the house was hers. She waited, knife ready, needing only to lure her sister home early. At 10:15 p.m., Saima left for work. Around 11, Saba sent her a text, pretending the youngest child was inconsolable and crying for her mother. 3 minutes later, Saima replied that she was on her way back. In reality, all 4 children were sound asleep. At 11:07 p.m., a neighbor's security camera caught Saima pulling into the driveway, stepping out of her car and walking toward the front door. Seconds later, the hallway light inside flicked on. 45 seconds after that, it went dark again. Within those few minutes, Saima Khan was ambushed in her own home. The moment Saima stepped through the front door and into the ground floor hallway, she had no idea that death was waiting just a few feet away. In an instant, her younger sister Saba lunged at her with the knife she had deliberately purchased the day before at the supermarket. Saima, caught completely off guard, lost those precious seconds that might have saved her life. She never expected her own sister to be the source of such danger, and the shock robbed her of the ability to defend herself. As the first blows landed, she struggled in vain, but the frenzied assault quickly overwhelmed her. Investigators would later confirm that Saima likely died within the first few minutes of the attack, screams that were quickly drowned out by the relentless violence of her assailant. Saba's rage knew no limits. She stabbed and slashed with such ferocity that by the end, Saima's body bore 68 separate wounds. The injuries were so savage that Saima's throat was cut almost completely through, leaving her close to decapitation. Even after her sister collapsed, Saba continued the onslaught, tearing off parts of her clothing and striking with such brutal force that one of Saima's arms was left hanging by little more than tissue and sinew. Upstairs, the eldest daughter was jolted awake. Frightened, she came to the top of the stairs and called out, asking her aunt what was happening. Sabah, in the middle of her gruesome act, snapped at the child, coldly ordering her back to bed and dismissing the horrific sounds as nothing more than her trying to catch a mouse. The little girl obeyed, unaware that her mother was being slaughtered just a few steps below. By then, Saima had lost massive amounts of blood. Several arteries in her jugular vein were severed. Her face, head, and arm were horribly mutilated. In the frenzy, Saba herself suffered a small cut, though she barely noticed. When the killing was over, she quickly moved on to the next phase of her plan, staging the crime as a robbery gone wrong. She smashed a pane of glass on the back door to make it look like an intruder had forced entry. Then she stripped off her bloodied clothing, stuffed it into a plastic bag along with the knife, Saima's phone, and some jewelry, and hid the items in her bedroom. Calmly, she showered, washing away the evidence of Saima's blood. Only after cleaning herself up did she call her parents and then dial emergency services. When her family rushed home, they were met with a nightmare. Saima lay in the hallway in a pool of blood, her life gone. The brutality of the scene shocked even the paramedics. The wounds were so severe that police initially believed the killer must have been a man. The first step for investigators was to question the only adult who had been in the house that night, Saima's younger sister, Sabah Khan. She recited her version of events with a calm, almost practiced tone. She explained, that evening, everyone else had been out. Her parents, brothers, and brother-in-law Hafiz had gone to a funeral at the mosque. While Saima had gone to work, Sabah had stayed behind to watch the children. She told detectives that she had put the children to bed, though the youngest had fussed a little, prompting her to message Saima and ask her to come home sooner. By the time the baby fell asleep, Sabah said she saw Saima's car pull into the driveway. Relieved, she decided to take a shower. According to her story, moments later, she heard a loud noise and her sister's screams. Throwing on a robe, she rushed downstairs and found Saima lying bloodied in the hallway. That was when she insisted. She phoned her parents and then called emergency services. When officers asked about the cut on her hand, she claimed she had injured herself on shards of glass near the broken back door. She said she hadn't seen or heard any intruder on the surface. Her explanation seemed plausible. The smashed glass, the missing jewelry, and the horrific scene were consistent with a violent burglary. Yet, detectives couldn't ignore the details that didn't add up. Sabah's demeanor struck them as oddly detached, almost rehearsed. Given the brutality of what had just happened, her lack of visible grief or panic raised quiet suspicions. Though investigators reminded themselves that people cope with trauma in different ways, still, one fact remained clear. This was no ordinary crime. The sheer ferocity of the attack, dozens of stab wounds, the attempt to mutilate, did not resemble a panicked burglar. It looked personal. It looked like vengeance. The entire family experienced incredible grief from losing a loved one. Hafiz was beside himself. He spoke about how their shared dream of moving into a new apartment with their 4 children had been cruelly destroyed. Both he and Saima had been counting down the days to that move, looking forward to starting a happier chapter together. Now, that future had been stolen from them forever. Relatives, friends, and even police officers pleaded with the public for any information that might help track down the killer who had ripped away the life of a devoted mother. The whole community of Luton and the surrounding areas was shaken to its core. Hafiz himself gave an emotional statement, saying their family's hearts had been torn to pieces. What he didn't know at the time was that the true motive behind Saima's murder was tied to his own secret. The autopsy results painted a horrific picture. Saima had been stabbed 68 times. Forensic experts concluded that she likely died after the first few blows, but the attacker kept plunging the knife into her body again and again. Long after death, detectives were convinced this wasn't the work of a burglar. A random intruder would never waste precious time inflicting so many wounds after the victim was already gone. This was personal. This was rage. With that in mind, detectives decided to revisit the testimony of their key witness, Sabah Khan. Sabah had been close to her sister, and investigators wanted to hear her version of events again. During questioning, Sabah told them that Saima had a dark secret, a secret lover. She even suggested that this man might have been the one to ambush and murder Saima. But instead of deflecting suspicion, her story had the opposite effect. Detectives noticed how Sabah seemed almost eager to smear her sister's reputation at a time when Saima could no longer defend herself. The claim didn't sit right. Family members, neighbors, and friends had all spoken about Saima's character. They were adamant she would never cheat on Hafiz. In fact, her life revolved around her children, her husband, and her part-time job. She barely had the time, let alone the energy, to pursue an affair. Still, investigators considered every angle. Could this have been an honor killing? The sheer brutality of the attack led some to believe the perpetrator was male. To narrow down suspects, Police mapped out the movements of each family member in the days before the crime and seized electronic devices from the household. It didn't take long before damning evidence began to surface. Detectives discovered that Saba had recently purchased a knife at a local supermarket, the very same model used in the attack. A review of her Google searches and phone data revealed an even darker truth. Saba had been carrying on a secret affair with Hafiz for the past 4 years. Their text messages left no doubt. Saba had often written about her hatred and resentment toward her sister, even accusing Hafiz of marrying Saima only to secure a passport. Their relationship had become so volatile that Hafiz eventually blocked her on social media. The case was unraveling quickly. On May 31, 2016, just 8 days after Saima's murder, detectives conducted a thorough search of Saba's bedroom. What they found erased any remaining doubt. Hidden inside were the pieces of jewelry supposedly stolen during the staged robbery. Even more damning, they uncovered Saima's missing phone, the blood-stained knife, and clothing Saba had worn on the night of the murder. Still soaked in Saima's blood, Saba was arrested immediately. At first, she denied having any part in Saima's death. Though she admitted to the affair with Hafiz, she tried to claim that the relationship had ended after a failed pregnancy and that she had distanced herself from him. Still, she clung to the story of a robbery gone wrong. But the irrefutable evidence found in her room made this claim difficult to support. After several rounds of interrogation, Saba finally broke down. She confessed to killing Saima. In her statement, she painted herself as a victim, saying Hafiz had manipulated her for years, even abused her physically, and that she felt trapped in a relationship with a man 10 years older, more experienced, and impossible to resist. The trial took place in October 2017, and it was there that Saba Khan finally admitted the truth. She pleaded guilty to the murder of her own sister. Prosecutors laid out the chilling details of her motive. What began as an infatuation with Hafiz Rahman had grown into a dangerous, obsessive fixation. She could no longer stand the fact that Hafiz belonged to someone else. In her mind, Saima's life looked flawless. Married, with children, and a stable home, while she herself remained in the shadows. That resentment turned into rage. Hafiz, taking the witness stand, described himself as a victim of manipulation. He admitted that he had made the grave mistake of giving in to Saba's advances, but he claimed he had been trapped by her threats. According to him, Saba often said she would harm herself if he ever left her, bombarding him with messages filled with desperate declarations of love. Despite his testimony about wanting to end things, prosecutors highlighted the undeniable fact that Hafiz had still continued sleeping with Saba. Even in the days leading up to the murder, the defense tried to shift some of the blame onto Hafiz. Saba's lawyer argued that Hafiz had taken advantage of a vulnerable young woman, one who had little experience with men and suffered from mental health struggles. He painted Saba as lonely, unstable, and desperate, reminding the court that she had a history of self-harm. According to the defense, Hafiz had strung her along for years, feeding her false hope of a future together, only to retreat when things became too complicated. Saba himself showed no remorse. Not a tear, not a trace of remorse. She sat motionless in the defendant's box, her face expressionless, her eyes hollow. It was clear she wasn't mourning Saima's stolen life. She was mourning her own freedom. Saba Khan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. The defense immediately sought an appeal, calling the sentence excessively harsh, but the Appeals Commission disagreed. The punishment, they said, was just. And so, Saba Khan remains behind bars in Bedfordshire, UK, where she will spend the best years of her life reflecting on the crime that destroyed her family. After the trial, Hafiz released a statement. He said He could never have imagined such horror unfolding within his own family. He admitted his deep shame for betraying his wife and confessed that not a day passes without regret. Hafiz remembered Saima as a devoted wife, a loving mother of 4 beautiful children, a daughter who made her parents proud, and a sister whose kindness touched everyone around her. He sighed. Her death left a permanent wound in the hearts of everyone who loved her. For her parents, the pain was almost unbearable. Losing one daughter is tragedy enough, but learning that another daughter was responsible, that was a nightmare no family should ever endure. And that brings us to the end of this tragic story, a story of jealousy, betrayal, and a family torn apart forever. On the night before Halloween, October 30th, 2001, police were called to a home in the affluent Coral Gables neighborhood of Florida after an alarm was triggered. Upon arrival, officers uncovered a horrifying crime scene. A woman was found brutally murdered on her kitchen floor in what looked like a scene from a horror movie. Blood covered the walls, with splatters even reaching the ceiling, a clear indication of extreme violence. Investigators determined that the victim, 45 years old Maggie Locascio, had been attacked after parking her car in her open garage. It appeared that the assailant had been waiting for her and struck as she exited the car. Though she managed to flee into the house, the attacker pursued her and ended her life there. Maggie was the estranged wife of Edward Locascio, to whom she had been married for nearly 30 years. They had recently separated and had not been living together for months. Maggie had even attempted to file a restraining order against Edward. Their separation was part of a contentious divorce, driven largely by Edward's repeated infidelities. The process was further complicated by serious disputes over financial matters, making him the immediate prime suspect. Maggie and Edward had met in 1972 while studying accounting at the University of Miami. After graduating, they married and worked as accountants. In 1982, Maggie became a homemaker following the birth of their son, Eddie Jr. Over time, Edward climbed the professional ladder, founding his own company and managing the finances of wealthy Miami clients. Unlike Edward, who was sociable and charismatic, Maggie was described as more private and reserved. In 1992, they purchased a mansion in prestigious Coral Gables, but by 2001, Edward had moved into an apartment in South Beach, just 10 minutes away by car. When police contacted Edward, they withheld the true nature of the situation and told him only that there had been an issue at his former home due to an alarm. They asked him to come by to assist. Edward arrived shortly afterward, appearing calm and cooperative as he spoke with investigators. He displayed no concern or curiosity about why the area was surrounded by police tape or why there were so many officers present. His indifference was notable, especially given that his estranged wife Maggie still lived at the house. Detectives eventually brought him to the station for further questioning. During his interview, Edward explained that he and Maggie were going through a divorce and had stopped interacting. He acknowledged that their relationship had been strained, with disagreements escalating to the point where Maggie had sought a restraining order against him for alleged threats, domestic violence, and abusive behavior. The first hearing related to their divorce was scheduled for the next morning. When police finally informed Edward that Maggie had been murdered, he showed no visible reaction. Meanwhile, Edward and Maggie's 19-year-old son, Eddie, was also being questioned in another room at the station. Eddie stated that he had been at the library that evening, and his alibi was confirmed. After the interrogations, Eddie crossed paths with his father in the corridor. Unlike Edward, who remained emotionless, Eddie displayed visible anger and disbelief. Later, Eddie told reporters that at that moment, he became convinced his father was responsible for his mother's murder. Tensions between Eddie and his father had already been high in recent years, and this tragic event only deepened the divide between them. Eddie openly despised his father, viewing him as a personification of the worst human traits. Despite Eddie's doubts, Edward claimed he had spent the day playing golf and was in his apartment on South Beach, several kilometers from the crime scene. At the time of the alleged murder, CCTV footage from his apartment confirmed his alibi, proving he couldn't have been the killer. Even though Edward was quickly ruled out as the perpetrator, the police remained suspicious of him. He had a strong motive for wanting Maggie dead, and the violent nature of the crime suggested hatred, likely from someone close to her. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have hired someone to carry out the murder. While reviewing the details of the case, a detective recalled seeing a white pickup truck making an illegal maneuver near Maggie's house on the night of the murder. Although he had wanted to stop the driver, he was responding to an emergency call at Maggie's residence. Now, he suspected the truck's driver might have been fleeing the crime scene. When asked if he knew anyone who owned a white pickup truck, Edward denied it. The investigation intensified, and the next day, a local resident contacted authorities about a small sports bag found in the bushes between his property and Maggie's house. The bag turned out to be crucial evidence. Inside were a blood-stained knife, bloody clothing, and Maggie's stolen credit cards. The bag was sent to a crime lab for analysis, where investigators hoped to find DNA, fibers, or fingerprints to identify the killer. 2 days after Maggie's death, Edward reported a break-in at his office. Police found no evidence of theft, but the office was in disarray, with documents scattered on the floor. Taking advantage of the situation, detectives interviewed Edward's employees about him and his family. A worker revealed that Edward's brother, Michael Lacasio, owned a white pickup truck, the same type of vehicle spotted near the crime scene. This revelation marked a turning point in the investigation. Michael, who lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, was quickly located by police. His truck immediately attracted attention because the seats had just been upholstered. When police removed the seat covers, they found the old fabric was stained and showed signs of having been pressure washed, possibly to remove evidence such as blood, since a complete clean was not possible. The seats were upholstered with new fabric. Unlike Edward, Michael had a troubled history. At 41 years old, he was unemployed, struggling with a banned substance addiction, and had a prior fraud conviction. It seemed plausible that he might commit murder, particularly if motivated by a banned substance or financial gain. Although no incriminating evidence directly connected Michael to the crime scene, the sports bag near Maggie's house became a critical clue. Latex gloves inside the bag contained Michael's DNA. Tests ruled out Edward and Eddie, confirming Michael as the likely suspect. 2 weeks after Maggie's murder, the lab results were finalized, and Michael was charged with killing Maggie. Eddie was shocked to learn that his uncle, Michael, was involved in the incident. He suspected that Michael could not have acted alone, because how could someone who lives so far away travel so far just to commit a crime? Eddie suspected there was more to the story and thought his father might somehow be connected. Regardless, the police needed concrete evidence to prove anything further. While there was no direct evidence implicating Edward, his brother, Michael was preparing to stand trial. Meanwhile, Edward continued with his everyday life, going to work and even dating. Michael faced murder charges, with prosecutors hoping he would confess and implicate Edward, who was believed, according to Eddie, to be the mastermind behind the crime. Prosecutors were confident they could uncover the truth, especially given that Michael faced the death penalty if convicted. Despite strong pressure, Michael firmly refused to plead guilty or testify against Edward, asserting his innocence. During the trial, prosecutors made it clear they believed both Michael and Edward were involved. However, this did not change Michael's stance. Although the prosecution presented strong evidence against Michael, much of it was circumstantial. His defense lawyer argued that the evidence was questionable due to procedural errors during the investigation and lab work. Furthermore, there was no clear motive, and much of the case relied on indirect evidence. Despite these arguments, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before finding Michael guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, a punishment likely designed to pressure him into confessing or exposing Edward's role in the crime. After the verdict, Eddie stepped in, determined to fight what he saw as an unjust decision. At just 19 years old, Eddie had already graduated from college and was attending the University of Miami Medical School, where he excelled academically. His relationship with his father, Edward, had always been strained. He never even called him Dad, referring to him as Ed instead. He pursued his studies with one key purpose: to help his mother, Maggie, escape her abusive marriage. Despite his efforts, he was unable to save her. However, he gained financial independence and tried to help her secure a divorce. Starting with a court injunction against Edward, Eddie believed his father's refusal to split their assets fairly was at the heart of the conflict. Under Florida law, divorcing spouses were required to divide their wealth equally. Edward, whose fortune was estimated at $6 million, refused to comply. He even tried to hide some of his wealth, but Maggie, an experienced accountant, discovered his deception and was determined to expose it. According to Eddie, Maggie was murdered because she was planning to reveal Edward's hidden accounts to the court just hours before their divorce trial began. The day after her murder, Edward's lawyer petitioned the court to terminate the divorce proceedings due to Maggie's death, a move that struck many as suspicious and calculating. With the case dismissed, Edward stood to retain control of all the family assets. Eddie was horrified by his father's cold reaction to his mother's death. He seemed entirely unbothered, despite having been married to her for years. Edward's greed and lack of remorse convinced Eddie that his father was responsible for the murder. Seeking justice, Eddie filed a civil lawsuit to block Edward from taking complete control of the family fortune and won the case. However, he faced significant challenges with the criminal investigation, which stalled for years. After 4 years with no progress, prosecutors doubted they would ever uncover the truth. Everything changed in November 2005, when authorities decided to move forward with the evidence they had, believing no new leads would emerge. Edward Lacasio was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to murder his wife, Maggie. Eddie saw this as a significant victory, but it was just the start of a much tougher battle. After spending 4 years securing a conviction against his uncle Michael for his mother's murder, Eddie now faced the challenge of bringing his father, Edward, to justice. This trial was far more complex due to the absence of direct evidence. In Michael's case, the crime scene held undeniable proof, including DNA and the murder weapon. However, Edward's charges rested solely on circumstantial evidence, giving his defense team considerable room to argue. The prosecution claimed Edward orchestrated Maggie's murder due to a strong financial motive. During their divorce proceedings, Edward stood to lose a large portion of his assets. Although he had hidden much of his wealth in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Maggie had uncovered the deception and planned to expose him in court. Unwilling to let this happen, Edward allegedly convinced his brother Michael to carry out the murder. Prosecutors argued that Edward had not only planned the killing, but had also influenced Michael to commit the brutal act. Graphic photos revealed the horrifying nature of Maggie's death. She had been savagely attacked with both a knife and a baton. She suffered multiple blunt force injuries that caused fractures, and the assailant had continued stabbing her even after the initial beating. The prosecution contended that this extreme violence stemmed directly from Edward's malicious intent. With little concrete evidence tying Edward to the crime, the case relied on motive, circumstantial evidence, and key witness testimonies. The first major point of suspicion came from Edward's lack of reaction when he was informed of Maggie's death. Although there was no written or recorded evidence of a conspiracy between Edward and Michael, phone records showed a spike in the number of calls between the brothers in the weeks leading up to the murder. Previously, they had only communicated occasionally on special occasions, but records showed that they had begun calling each other on an unusually daily basis 6 weeks before Maggie's death. This sudden change became a major point of suspicion for investigators. The prosecution argued that Edward used these calls to pressure Michael into committing the crime and to finalize the plan. A critical witness was Edward's secretary, Gudile Gonzalez. who testified that she overheard several phone calls between Edward and Michael. After realizing the nature of these conversations, Goudelet said Edward began threatening her, warning her to stay silent or risk being killed. Frightened, she eventually went to the police. Eddie, Edward and Maggie's son, also took the stand, recounting years of abuse Maggie suffered during her marriage. He described instances in which Edward had beaten his mother, threatened her, and even came close to hitting her with a heavy sculpture. According to Eddie, Edward openly threatened to kill Maggie 5 months before her death, after she revealed her intention to file for divorce. Tensions escalated when Maggie caught Edward having an affair with Eleanor Salazar, a masseuse. Eleanor also testified in court, stating that she was at Edward's house at around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the murder and witnessed a conversation between Edward and Michael. Surveillance footage from Edward's house supported Eleanor's account. The video showed Michael arriving at Edward's home around midnight, drenched and visibly distressed. He was seen gesturing wildly, which the prosecution interpreted as a sign that he had just finished cleaning blood out of his truck. Eleanor further testified that Edward later threatened her, warning that she would suffer a fate worse than Maggie's if she went to the authorities. Surveillance footage partially verified Edward's whereabouts that night. While bolstering Eleanor's credibility, financial records also uncovered Edward's multi-million-dollar offshore accounts, which he had concealed during the divorce to limit what Maggie could claim. This financial evidence reinforced the prosecution's claim about Edward's motive, emphasizing that Maggie's knowledge of his hidden assets posed a serious threat to him. Edward's behavior after the murder raised serious concerns. He quickly moved on with his life, even starting a new relationship. During an argument with his new girlfriend, Edward allegedly threatened her, stating that she would end up like his wife. Alarmed by this threat, she decided to report it to the police. In court, the prosecution presented a gruesome reconstruction of the murder. Using a mannequin, they demonstrated how Michael brutally attacked Maggie. She suffered 8 blows to the head with a metal baton, but remained conscious and tried to defend herself. The assault bent the baton, rendering it useless. Maggie sustained severe defensive injuries, including nearly losing a finger while trying to protect herself. Despite her resistance, Michael continued his attack, pinning her against a wall and eventually standing on her chest to ensure her death. Blood evidence found throughout the house supported the prosecution's narrative. However, Edward's defense focused on the lack of direct evidence linking him to a conspiracy with Michael. There were no written or recorded agreements or explicit discussions about the crime. However, the prosecution asserted that Edward had a clear motive, suspicious behavior, and personality, and called on the jury to consider the circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Following the murder, no money was transferred to Michael, and Edward did not provide him with any support while he was in prison. Michael appeared to gain nothing from the crime and had no clear motive to kill Maggie. Initially, investigators speculated that the killer might have had a secret relationship with Maggie, but there was no evidence to confirm this, as they had no prior contact. Edward's lawyer argued that the attack was random, possibly driven by Michael's mental state or substance abuse. In contrast, the prosecution maintained that Edward had strong motives to want his wife gone. Adding to the complexity, Edward's defense painted him as a kind and loving husband and father. They presented photos of a happy family life and called witnesses to attest to his character. The defense also attempted to shift the narrative by suggesting that Eddie, Edward's own son, may have had a financial motive to target his father in order to inherit the family's wealth. The most damaging testimony came from Edward's secretary, Goudelet. She testified that Edward had threatened her and stated that Michael would kill Maggie. The defense countered by arguing that Goudelet's story had changed multiple times, which weakened her credibility. The prosecution explained her inconsistencies as stemming from her discomfort with Edward's explicit and obscene language, which she rephrased for the jury. Nevertheless, her changing story raised questions about her reliability. Further complicating the situation, the defense pointed out that Goodallay was in a long-term romantic relationship with the lead detective on the case, which raised ethical concerns. By the time of Edward's trial, she had been living with the detective for over a year. The defense argued that this relationship undermined her testimony, suggesting that her involvement was part of a deliberate effort to bias the case against Edward. Another key point presented by the prosecution was the 39 phone calls exchanged between Edward and Michael over the course of 6 weeks. Previously, the brothers had little to no contact, often going years without speaking. The content of these calls remains unknown. The defense argued that the calls were innocent, suggesting that the brothers had simply grown closer during Edward's divorce proceedings. However, the dramatic increase in communication heightened the suspicion surrounding Edward's involvement. The argument that Edward had a financial motive for murder was dismissed. Even if he had lost half of his assets in a divorce, he would still have remained a millionaire, making it illogical for him to take such a drastic action. The defense also claimed that Michael, due to his struggles with addiction and mental health issues, might have committed the crime without having a clear motive. They suggested Michael could have misinterpreted Edward's frustration over the divorce and acted impulsively against Maggie. Furthermore, the defense argued that Michael's unstable nature would have made it unlikely for him to remain silent and not implicate Edward, especially when facing the death penalty. After both sides presented their cases, the jury deliberated for several days. The case was challenging, as it relied primarily on circumstantial evidence. Initially, the jury debated Edward's and Michael's motives, but eventually focused on Edward's potential financial incentives and Michael's apparent lack of motive. On the third day of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. Edward Locascio was found guilty of first-degree murder. His son, Eddie, and his grandmother were present at the sentencing. Eddie expressed relief over the verdict, feeling that justice had finally been served after 6 long years since his mother's death. Although Edward initially faced the possibility of the death penalty, the jury recommended a life sentence without parole, which was ultimately imposed. Given Edward's age, this effectively meant he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. However, the decision enraged Eddie, who firmly believed that the death penalty would have been more appropriate. 6 months into his imprisonment, Edward gave an interview where he continued to proclaim his innocence. He denied encouraging his brother Michael to commit the murder, claiming that he had hoped to reconcile with Maggie before her death. He insisted he never believed Michael was capable of such a brutal crime and alleged that both he and Michael had been framed. Michael also maintained his innocence and never confessed. Nevertheless, DNA evidence confirmed his involvement, and the timing of the murder, just before a contentious divorce hearing, was difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. During the interview, Edward suggested that his son, Eddie, may have orchestrated the crime. He theorized that Eddie, eager to inherit his parents' fortune, might have set him up to take the blame. Edward reiterated that the divorce settlement would not have left him destitute, leaving him no reason to kill Maggie. Eddie strongly denied these accusations. Edward Locascio later passed away on August 30th, 2018, at the age of 67 in a prison hospital in Lake Butler, Florida. The home where the murder occurred was eventually sold for $3 million. Eddie went on to become a doctor, dedicating his life to helping others. Larissa Rodriguez grew up in a humble but close-knit family. Her parents were modest and reserved. They raised her with strong values of integrity, a strong work ethic, and family loyalty. From an early age, Larissa showed remarkable discipline. She trained in gymnastics, later graduated with a degree in sports science, and worked as a trainer and instructor at a fitness club. She led a healthy lifestyle, avoided harmful habits, meticulously cared for her well-being. She had only one serious relationship with Luis Antonio Garnica, who became her first partner and later her husband. To the family, he seemed quiet and polite. Larissa believed in the ideal of a strong family, and despite strains in their relationship, she remained committed to preserving the marriage. Luis came from a off background. His father had served as mayor of Pontal, and Louis himself was trained in medicine. But behind that veneer of success, he was self-centered and calculating. According to Larissa's relatives, at the beginning of their relationship, he had no steady income and depended on Larissa's mother, who sent him home cooked meals over time. Despite having a diploma, his finances never improved, and he struggled to support two parallel lives: his official marriage and a secret relationship. His standing among Larissa's friends and family deteriorated. He grew increasingly withdrawn, distant, and indifferent. Even during Larissa's mother's final days, he visited only when forced. In the last months of the marriage, Louis was emotionally detached, cold, and often degraded his wife about her appearance, avoiding any real communication. Despite her efforts to reconcile, he continued to move further away, ignoring the obvious signs of their relationship's crisis. Elisabetta Arabaza, Louise's mother, played a pivotal role in this story. At 68, she appeared quiet and unassuming, but in reality, she was a manipulator with a troubling history. Her former husband and her daughter claimed she had a gambling problem and was deeply in debt. There were suspicions surrounding her involvement in the mysterious death of a relative connected through financial dealings. She often asked acquaintances for money and was suspected of selling others' jewelry. Her behavior within the Garnica family drew mixed opinions. With Larissa, she maintained the image of a caring mother-in-law, yet she regularly shared confidential information with her son and withheld crucial details from her daughter-in-law. Over time, it became clear she had played a decisive role in tearing the family apart and setting the stage for the tragic events that followed. These three figures, Larissa, Louise, and Elisabetta, became the central players in a chain of events whose outcomes were irreversible. In the spring of 2025, tensions between Larissa and Louise escalated dramatically. Their conflicts had become a regular occurrence, and any remaining trust was shattered. Louise's behavior grew increasingly distant. He often claimed to be working late or on call, but in reality, he was frequently meeting with another woman named Letitia. Larissa didn't know the woman's name at first, but she began to suspect he was seeing someone else, especially after noticing odd changes in his routine and his frequent irritation for no clear reason. Her suspicions were confirmed after she discreetly followed him one evening in mid-March. Larissa spotted Louise heading toward Letitia's house on a night he claimed to be working an overnight shift. Not long after that, she found personal items in his car, along with a medical-grade anesthetic, which clearly indicated a secretive relationship. She confided in Elisabetta, her mother-in-law, hoping for understanding. Instead, Elisabetta quickly told Louise about the confrontation and criticized Larissa for spying on him. Rather than receiving comfort, Larissa was told that being unfaithful is just something men do. Larissa didn't act on impulse. Despite her personal disappointment, she still tried to preserve her family. According to her father, she wanted to have a calm conversation with Louise and find a peaceful resolution. Over the next few days, she spoke privately with close friends about the possibility of divorce, but asked them not to get involved. Meanwhile, a friend offered her temporary use of an unoccupied apartment to help her take a step back and think things through. On March 15, 2025, Larissa tells Louise of her decision to end the marriage. She also confirmed her intentions to a trusted friend. Her goal was to reduce tension and prepare for a respectful separation. The following day, March 16th, Elisabetta Arabaza began researching highly toxic substances online. That same day, she offered Larissa homemade soup. Larissa, unaware of any danger, accepted the meal. Within hours, she began experiencing severe gastrointestinal symptoms, including cramps and nausea. Despite feeling unwell, Larissa assumed the discomfort was caused by stress or possibly spoiled food. On March 18th, Larissa once again opened up to a close friend, expressing how drained she felt physically and emotionally. She said her energy was slipping away and shared her concern that Louise continued to avoid any meaningful conversation. At the same time, Elizabeth, his mother, became unusually attentive, bringing food, initiating frequent visits, and insisting on helping Larissa, despite previously criticizing her for wanting to leave the marriage. By March 19th, Larissa confided in a relative about her worsening condition. She described sudden chills, weakness, abdominal pain, and an overwhelming sense of dread. She noted that she had never experienced anything like it before, and that the symptoms had persisted for several days. That message would become one of the last times she discussed her health. On March 20th, Larissa told her father she no longer saw a future in the marriage. Though she was still hoping to avoid a public fallout, she wanted the divorce to be amicable, if possible. That day, Elizabeth seemed calm but continued bringing over food. Larissa, although feeling unwell, didn't yet suspect a link between the meals and her condition. She assumed her health issues stemmed from emotional stress. Then came March 21st. Elizabeth arrived again with homemade soup. Larissa's condition took a drastic turn for the worse. By late that evening, she stopped responding to calls and messages. A few hours later, the devastating news came. She had passed away. On the morning of March 22nd, 2025, Louise reported that he had found his wife unconscious in their apartment. He claimed he'd just returned from a night shift, walked in, and found Larissa lying on the floor. According to his account, he immediately began CPR and called emergency services. However, discrepancies between his story and the actual evidence began to surface within hours of the investigation. One critical detail was a message Louise sent to Leticia. At 10:25 m.m., he texted Leticia to tell her that Larissa had passed away. Just 9 minutes later, at 10:34 m., paramedics arrived. Yet, when they entered, Louise was still performing resuscitation efforts, claiming Larissa was showing signs of life. The medical team quickly determined otherwise. She was already in a state of rigor mortis, making revival impossible. Emergency personnel documented that her body was cold, with no pulse or breathing, and her skin showed clear signs consistent with an extended time of death. When police arrived at the scene, one of the first things they noted was Louise's insistence on a rapid cremation. He didn't notify Larissa's family right away about her passing and took it upon himself to begin arranging the necessary paperwork for cremation. This immediately raised red flags for investigators, especially since Larissa's cultural background strictly followed burial traditions, with cremation never being considered. At the scene, officers noticed that the environment had been tampered with. Bed sheets had been stripped, rolled up. Towels with what appeared to be reddish stains were found nearby, and the laundry basket contained items possibly used for cleanup. The paramedic examining Larissa's body took note of undigested food in her stomach. This detail would later become a critical piece of evidence, prompting a full toxicology analysis. The initial assumption of a sudden cardiac event began to shift toward concerns about a possible poisoning. Louise's behavior on the day Larissa died seemed artificial, as if he were acting to make her death look like a sudden accident. The timeline, the messages he sent, and his behavior before and after emergency services arrived painted a picture that seemed increasingly rehearsed. At first glance, Louise seemed like a distraught husband caught in a crisis, but as investigators dug deeper, examining documents, message logs, and expert findings, the surface narrative started to unravel. Attention shifted from simply understanding what happened to examining who may have played a role in the moments immediately after Larissa's life ended. Following the official announcement of Larissa's death, Louise came under increasing scrutiny. Within just 24 hours of the incident, his actions raised serious concerns. The day after Larissa's passing, attempted financial transactions were discovered using her bank accounts. Louise used her debit card to purchase items at a pharmacy and attempted to withdraw cash from an ATM. Several of these transactions were flagged and declined due to suspicious activity. One attempt to access her savings account failed because of automatic security blocks. Later, bank officials confirmed that the attempted transactions originated from devices registered to Louise. At a local bank branch in Pontal, a teller reported an unusual request. Viviani, Louise's sister, attempted to obtain account information for Larissa. Despite having no legal authority to access those records, Larissa's account was registered in a different region, and Viviani's attempt to retrieve private financial data without a formal power of attorney was officially logged as an unauthorized access attempt. This incident immediately drew the attention of investigators. Meanwhile, Larissa's family, especially her brother and father, pushed for a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death. Troubled by rumors and inconsistencies, Larissa's brother sought legal counsel from attorney. Consultations with legal representatives began on March 24th, 2 days after her death. Despite online speculation suggesting Larissa may have taken her own life, her loved ones firmly rejected that possibility. According to those close to her, Larissa had no history of mental health struggles, maintained an active lifestyle, was in therapy, and had clear plans for her future, including filing for divorce. The attorney hired by Larissa's family demanded that no cremation take place until a full toxicological analysis was completed. This move proved critical to the case. The pathologist ordered a comprehensive examination, including toxicology screenings. While the initial exam did not pinpoint an immediate cause of death, the lab tests became central to developing the leading theory. At the same time, investigators focused on digital evidence, combing through text messages, GPS data, and call logs. Recovered chats between Louise, Viviani, and others provided deeper insight. One particularly telling exchange showed Viviani advising Louise to be cautious with their phones and not to confuse devices. In another message, she reminded him to mention a supposed history of heart conditions in Larissa's family when speaking to authorities. These texts were interpreted as an attempt to shape a false narrative and create a medically plausible explanation for what had occurred. While the investigation remained active, the family's lawyer successfully petitioned to freeze all of Larissa's financial accounts and restrict access to her assets. Authorities across relevant agencies were notified. These legal safeguards were essential in preventing further unauthorized actions by Louise and those allegedly working with him. At this point, investigators completely ruled out her own life. Every move Louise and Viviani made following Larissa's passing appeared calculated, aimed at reducing exposure and covering their tracks. These patterns were sufficient to launch the formal phase of criminal proceedings. Roughly 1 month before Larissa passed away, another family member died under mysterious circumstances, Natalia, daughter of Elisabetti. At the time, the incident received no public attention. Natalia lived in Pontal with a long-term partner in a domestic relationship. Shortly before her death, she had a major falling out with her mother. Elisabetti strongly opposed Natalia's plans to start a family and become a parent. Their arguments centered around inheritance issues and shares in the family business. Following the disagreement, Natalia's partner left the house, leaving her alone with Elisabetti, something relatives later described as highly unusual. In the days that followed, Natalia complained of feeling increasingly unwell. However, Elisabetti never sought medical help or contacted emergency services. Instead, she reached out to Louise and Viviani, who were in another city at the time. The drive from Ribeirão Preto to Pontal takes approximately 40 minutes. During this time, Natalia remained without assistance. By the time Louise and Viviani arrived, Natalia's condition had deteriorated significantly. She was later taken to a hospital where she died. Eyewitnesses claimed that despite his medical training, Louise didn't advocate for emergency care and seemed more focused on when the death certificate would be issued. This detail was documented and became the subject of further investigation. Initially, Natalia's death was classified as natural, but as Larissa's case unfolded, new findings began to cast serious doubt on that conclusion. One red flag was the unexplained death of Natalia's dog. 2 weeks before the tragedy, relatives reported that the dog had no known health issues, authorities approved the exhumation of the pet for toxicology testing based on the theory that poison might have been tested on the animal. Natalia's father, Antonio, revealed during questioning that Elizabeth was facing serious financial problems. He stated Elizabeth had debts exceeding 300,000 reais, some of which were linked to gambling. Natalia held a 16% share in the family business, which, because she had no dependent children, passed directly to her mother upon her death. Antonio also testified that not long before she passed, Natalia had mentioned receiving threats from her mother regarding her personal life. Elizabeth's alleged efforts to secure full control over those assets led to major tensions with her ex-husband. Further disturbing details emerged about Elizabeth's past. Years earlier, a friend recalled a strange episode. After having tea with Elizabeth, she experienced sharp abdominal pain, followed by unconsciousness. Emergency care saved her, and doctors later suspected a toxic substance had been involved. However, that case was never formally investigated. As Larissa's story gained public attention, more people connected to the Garnica family began stepping forward, sharing concerns about Elizabeth's behavior. After reviewing the series of suspicious patterns, investigators reached a preliminary conclusion. Natalia may have been the first confirmed victim, and her dog potentially part of a test run for what followed. The combination of poisoning, delayed medical response, concealed symptoms, and a motive rooted in inheritance formed a disturbing picture. From this point forward, the case took on a much broader scope. A deeper analysis of these incidents revealed a consistent pattern in Elizabeth's financial behavior. She repeatedly sought new sources of income, pressured those close to her, and manipulated legal access to property and assets. After Natalia and Larissa passed, these tactics intensified in the context of mounting debts and financial instability. Her motives became a central focus of the investigation. Amid the dual investigations into the deaths of Larissa and Natalia, law enforcement began uncovering information that hinted at additional potentially criminal episodes linked to Elizabeth Arabate. The case involved a woman who had been friendly with Elizabeth. Years after an odd incident, she finally spoke out. Following a tea visit at Elizabeth's home, she suddenly felt dizzy, nauseous, and disoriented. Elizabeth offered her a headache remedy, a blue capsule. She took the pill, but was later hospitalized that night with suspected poisoning. Doctors documented toxic exposure to an unknown substance, but the woman never filed a report at the time. She later admitted she was afraid of becoming entangled in legal battles. Eventually, she reached out to Larissa's family attorney after media reports surfaced about possible poisonings. Yet another concerning event came to light. Elizabeth had attempted to obtain power of attorney from a woman expecting to receive court-ordered compensation. The woman, alarmed by Elizabeth's persistence, later told investigators she feared she might have been a future target. Her statement was formally included in the case files. According to law enforcement, a clear pattern was beginning to emerge in Elizabeth's actions. She would first establish close relationships with financially stable women, earn their trust, and shortly afterward, they would suffer sudden and unexplained health issues. Given these accounts, investigators began pursuing a new theory. They might be dealing with a series of connected incidents rather than isolated ones. Law enforcement officials issued a public appeal, urging anyone who had experienced suspicious behavior from Elizabeth Arabate to contact authorities. Once the toxicology reports came in, the investigation entered a decisive phase. Forensic specialists confirmed the presence of a compound derived from chumbinho, a banned toxic substance in Larissa's system. This finding was pivotal. Until then, Louise and Elizabeth had claimed that Larissa passed away from natural causes, but the chemical evidence completely debunked their story. Another critical piece of the puzzle came from surveillance footage at the residential complex. Security cameras showed that, on the morning of March 22nd, Louise arrived at the apartment later than he had claimed, and Viviani arrived shortly before emergency services were called. These details directly contradicted their official statements. Taken together, the presence of a toxic compound, suspicious online searches, misleading explanations, tampered evidence, and timeline inconsistencies formed a clear chain of evidence. Investigators concluded that Larissa's death was not a random event, but a carefully coordinated act carried out by multiple individuals. The evidence didn't just suggest wrongdoing, it presented a legally viable case of premeditated criminal activity. By mid-April 2025, the investigation reached the stage of formal charges. Based on forensic data, digital correspondence, and verified discrepancies in witness accounts, police filed charges against three primary individuals: Elisabete Arabat, Luis Garnica, and his sister, Viviane Garnica. The main charge involved the intentional death of Larissa Rodriguez through poisoning. Investigators determined that Elisabete had prepared Larissa's meals in the final days of her life, actively researched toxic substances, created a plan to conceal the act, and coordinated the actions of her family members. Luis was charged as an accomplice. He was aware of his mother's intentions, failed to intervene, concealed signs of poisoning, and helped destroy evidence afterward. He was also the one who pushed for rapid cremation, a move that could have eliminated the chance of detecting any toxic substances. Viviane was also named as an accomplice. Her role included coordination with her brother, erasing digital traces, attempting to access the victim's bank accounts, and helping conceal key details surrounding the incident. Recovered messages from her phone confirmed that she knew about Larissa's death in advance and was involved in planning how to speak with law enforcement and medical professionals. Simultaneously, a separate investigation was launched into the circumstances surrounding Natalia's passing. Another contributing factor was the earlier death of Natalia's dog, which had also raised alarms. While formal charges in Natalia's case had not yet been filed, the evidence was placed in a separate investigative file. The charges against all three individuals were formally submitted to the district attorney's office. Each was summoned for questioning. Following the interrogation, both Elisabete and Luis were taken into custody. Viviane was placed under travel restrictions, required to remain within the region, and ordered to surrender her passport. Meanwhile, the court approved a request to seize Garnica family assets and freeze all accounts tied to the suspects. The case sparked significant public interest. Journalists, advocacy groups, and legal experts began a national conversation about the shortcomings in addressing domestic aggression, legal loopholes in women's protection, and missed warning signs. Many pointed out that the tragedy might have been avoided had social services intervened earlier. At this point, the charges have been formally established, and the investigation has completed the collection of core evidence. Next, the trial will proceed, with the expectation of revealing the whole truth to the public. It was just after 4:30 in the morning when the tracking app on Sade Robinson's phone suddenly went dark. Earlier that night, she had left work, excited about her first date with a man she'd recently met. By sunrise, her car was in flames, and along the shores of Lake Michigan, something unimaginable was waiting to be discovered. Sade Robinson was born in 2004 in Vicksburg, Mississippi. She is the daughter of Sheena Scarborough and Carlos Robinson. Her life changed early on, when she was just a year old. Her parents separated. Sade then moved with her mother to Milwaukee, settling into her grandparents' home. This city would become the backdrop of her formative years, and the place where her vibrant personality began to bloom. From the start, Sade stood out. She was curious, energetic, and always eager to learn about the world around her. She approached every activity, from soccer to Girl Scouts, with great enthusiasm. These early experiences not only allowed her to shine, but also helped shape her natural skills in leadership, teamwork, and discipline. Though Sade's father lived in Florida, she maintained a close bond with him. Frequent visits between states became a routine part of her life, and through them, she developed a rare sense of independence and responsibility at a young age. As she grew older, Sade's passions began to take clearer form. She was drawn to the arts, especially rap music and dance, where she could express herself freely. But her dreams weren't limited to the creative world. She also felt a deep desire to serve her country and envisioned herself someday joining the armed forces. Her academic record was equally impressive. Said was known as a standout student, always focused and determined. Yet, even with her achievements, she wasn't immune to challenges. During 7th grade, she encountered difficulties at school. As a result, she made the brave decision to relocate to Florida and live with her father, seeking a fresh start. Once again, Said showed resilience in her new environment. She continued to excel, both socially and academically. Teachers and peers alike admired her focus, her ambition, and her quiet confidence, one that was rooted in strength rather than pride. In 2019, after spending several years in Florida, she returned to Milwaukee to live with her mother. When her final year of high school arrived in 2021, Said poured herself into her studies, managing to graduate an entire semester early, yet another example of her unwavering determination. By 2024, at just 19 years old, Said Robinson embodied a rare blend of discipline, ambition, and independence. She was pursuing a degree in art at Milwaukee Area Technical College, balancing her education with 2 full-time jobs. But her ambitions didn't stop there. She had already set her sights on a future in criminal law. Through sheer effort and careful, Said was able to accomplish a major milestone. She bought her own car. It was more than just a vehicle. It represented her growing independence. Not long after, she moved out of her mother's home and rented her very own apartment. She balanced 2 demanding jobs to support herself. One of them was at Pizza Shuttle, where her work ethic, discipline, and initiative didn't go unnoticed. She quickly rose through the ranks and was promoted to manager. Her second job was at the prestigious Wisconsin Country Club, where she also helped her younger sister secure a position, making sure her sibling had access to the same opportunities that had shaped her own path. At that moment, her future looked incredibly bright. She had clear goals, the discipline to chase them, and the kind of maturity most people twice her age hadn't yet reached. Yet, behind all of that strength and focus, Said still carried the hopes of any young woman her age. She dreamed of love, companionship, and a meaningful connection. What she never expected was that this search would lead her into the most dangerous moment of her life. April 1st, 2024 began like any other day for Saad. She started her morning shift at Pizza Shuttle, as she often did, took a few moments before work to catch up with her mother over FaceTime. Everything about the day seemed routine until the end of her shift. Said was excited because she had a date planned that evening with a man she had recently met through a dating app. She left work to meet him. That would be the last time anyone in her group would see or hear from her. The following day, April 2nd, Said didn't show up for her shift. She hadn't called in sick or left a message, which was completely out of character. Concern quickly spread among her co-workers. They began texting and calling her, hoping for an explanation, but there was no reply. Her family and close friends also began to worry. None of them had heard from her since the day before. As hours passed without a word, worry turned into panic. Those closest to her knew something was wrong. This was a chilling and inexplicable silence. As night fell and still no answers emerged, one of Said's friends made the police and report her missing. Before doing so, she checked Said's most recent social media activity and found something crucial: a Snapchat post of Saad. The timestamp was around 9 p.m. on the night of April 1st. That would be the final digital trace Saad left behind. On April 3rd, with no updates and mounting concern, police officers went to Saad's apartment. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer and no sounds from within. Unbeknownst to them, authorities elsewhere in the city had already made a horrifying discovery. At around 7:30 a.m. on April 2nd, 2024, the Milwaukee Fire Department received a report from local residents about a car on fire. When emergency crews arrived, they found thick smoke and flames engulfing a 2020 Honda Civic. The vehicle had been abandoned and was burning rapidly. Firefighters managed to contain the blaze. No one was inside the car, but the contents of the trunk raised immediate concern. A black coat, a pair of ripped jeans, and other women's clothing, charred but still identifiable. A cell phone, partially damaged by heat, was also recovered. The authorities now had physical evidence, but they still needed to know who the car belonged to. That answer would come soon, and it would change everything. Later that same day, Milwaukee County Sheriff's deputies were called to a different location. A man waiting for a friend had been walking along the edge of a park's beach when he stumbled upon something horrifying, a human leg lying near the shoreline. Forensic teams were called in, and after careful analysis, they determined the leg belonged to an African-American female. The remains were dismembered, but the condition of the limbs suggested the crime had occurred recently. As the investigation into Sade's disappearance continued, one of the officers who had earlier visited her apartment learned of the discovery of the human remains. The physical description of the remains closely matched the details provided in the missing persons report for Sade. Then, a second chilling confirmation arrived. The Honda Civic found burning that morning was registered to Sade Robinson. With the pieces beginning to fall into place, detectives returned to her apartment. They spoke with the building's maintenance worker, who revealed that he had seen Sade on the morning of April 1st. She seemed excited and said she was looking forward to a date after her shift. Investigators pulled the building's surveillance footage, which showed Sade leaving her apartment at 9 p.m. On April 1st, she never returned. That footage, combined with the evidence from the car and the park, created an urgent new direction for the case. Authorities subpoenaed her phone records from her mobile carrier and traced her last text message to a number with a 262 area code. They didn't yet know who the number belonged to, but the content of the exchange made it clear it was the man she had planned to meet that night. Using that lead, police began cross-referencing phone data with surveillance footage. It soon emerged that Sade and her date had met at a local venue called the Twisted Fisherman. Footage from the bar and witness statements from staff confirmed their presence there that evening. Another key piece of evidence came from the same friend who had filed the missing persons report. She revealed that she had access to Sade's location through an app called Life 360, commonly used to track friends and family in real time. According to the app's log, the last known location for Sade Robinson was Warnimont Park at 4:30 a.m. on April 2nd. A clearer timeline began to take shape. Investigators learned that she was originally scheduled to meet her date at 5 p.m. on April 1st at a place called Brad House. However, at the last minute, the man changed the location to a different venue, Twisted Fisherman, a bar where he had previously worked. He claimed he needed to stop by to pick up some paperwork. Sade had no objection. At 5:20 p.m., she arrived at Twisted Fisherman. He was already there, waiting at the bar. The two sat side by side, ordered drinks and food, and chatted casually as the evening unfolded. Just over an hour later, they left the bar together, got into Sade's car, and drove to a second location, Duke's, another bar. They spent roughly 3 hours at Duke's before heading to a residential neighborhood in southwestern Milwaukee, where they remained for several more hours. At some point in the early morning hours of April 2nd, Sade's phone showed movement again, this time heading toward Warnimont Park. At 4:35, her Life 360 tracking app went silent. The battery had died. That was the last signal the phone would ever send. All signs pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Sade Robinson had been murdered, and the person she had trusted enough to meet that night was now the prime suspect. Thanks to swift and coordinated work by law enforcement, the investigation progressed rapidly. Authorities had already zeroed in on one individual. Though his name was still unknown to the public, police knew he was the last person to see Sade alive. The evidence they had gathered was enough to obtain both an arrest warrant and a search warrant for the residence traced from Sade's phone activity. On April 4th at 1 p.m., officers moved in. They arrived at the suspect's home and took him into custody. His identity was finally confirmed. Maxwell Anderson, a 33-year-old man and the son of a well-known businessman in the region. Following his arrest, disturbing details about his background began to emerge. Throughout his life, Anderson had exhibited a pattern of problematic behavior. His own father had once tried to help him by giving him a position in the family business, but eventually fired him, stating that he was unfit for the job. Anderson was also a U.S. Navy veteran, but in recent years he had drifted from one job to the next, working primarily as a bartender in various establishments across Milwaukee. None of the positions lasted long. Between 2014 and 2019, he had multiple arrests on record, mostly for minor offenses such as public disorder and disturbances. Investigators worked to determine exactly how Said and Anderson first met. The initial assumption was that they had connected through a dating app, but another theory surfaced. They may have crossed paths in person at one of the bars where Anderson had worked, locations that Said and her friends were known to frequent. Following the arrest of Maxwell Anderson, detectives launched an extensive search of his residence. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. In one of the bedrooms, investigators discovered bloodstains on the bedding and on a wall leading down to the basement. That area, they soon realized, held even more disturbing clues. Inside the basement, they located multiple gas canisters and electric saws, items that raised immediate suspicion. The basement wasn't just a storage area, it appeared to have been prepared for something dark, something planned. The space, now a central point in the investigation, suggested that the crime against Said had been both premeditated and executed with chilling precision. The search for evidence did not stop there. On April 6th, just days after the house search, investigators returned to the area where Said's burned car had been discovered. Just 1 block away, they made another gruesome find: a human foot. The skin tone, size, and pink nail polish matched the severed leg recovered earlier. It belonged to Said. Meanwhile, detectives continued to comb through surveillance footage near the scene of the car fire. It was here they uncovered a critical piece of evidence. Security cameras captured Maxwell Anderson stepping out of Said's Honda Civic moments before setting it ablaze. Several bystanders in the area at the time later identified him as the man responsible. After starting the fire, Anderson was seen calmly walking away and boarding a nearby bus. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came from a key witness who knew Anderson personally. Alarmed by the news of Said's disappearance, this individual immediately went to the police. What they shared would reshape the entire investigation. A month before the crime, on March 5th, Anderson had allegedly described a plan to lure a woman to his basement, shoot her, dismember her body, and scatter the remains across the city. At the time, it seemed like a disturbing joke. In retrospect, it was a blueprint. The witness went on to describe a visit to Anderson's house just days before the murder. The basement, they said, was covered in plastic sheeting. There were 3 saws in plain view, a large tarp, and an area staged with intimate objects, further suggesting the calculated nature of the crime. Authorities feared there could be additional victims and began re-examining other reports linked to Anderson. In February 2024, a woman came forward claiming that after meeting Anderson at a bar, he invited her to his home. Once there, she began to feel unwell, leading her to suspect he had drugged her drink. She escaped before anything could happen. That escape may have saved her life. With mounting evidence, physical, digital, and testimonial, the prosecution built a powerful case. On April 12th, just 10 days after Said Robinson vanished, Maxwell Anderson was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and arson to conceal a crime. Though Anderson continued to claim innocence, the case against him was overwhelming. On the morning of June 6, 2025, the courtroom in Milwaukee was silent and tense. Families, reporters, and community members filled every seat. After months of grief, outrage, and unanswered questions, the moment had finally arrived. The jury had reached its decision. It took less than a day of deliberation. By 9:00 a.m. the next morning, their verdict was ready. Maxwell Anderson found guilty on all counts. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, hiding a corpse, arson. It was official. The man who had lured 19-year-old Sade Robinson on a first date only to brutally kill and dismember her was now legally responsible for one of the most horrifying crimes Milwaukee had ever seen. The trial had laid bare every excruciating detail. Jurors were shown hundreds of surveillance images and forensic photographs. They listened to the testimony of dozens of witnesses. They saw snapshots of Sade in her final hours, alive, vulnerable, and unaware of the fate awaiting her. The prosecutor made the case clear. Sade was killed inside Anderson's home. He later dismembered her body, her remains, legs, arms, torso, even her right breast were scattered across counties. Some were found in the lake, others washed ashore, and in an attempt to erase it all, he set her car ablaze and walked away. Maxwell Anderson did not testify, and his defense team called no witnesses. His lawyer claimed the murder wasn't planned. However, the evidence suggested otherwise, revealing a sequence of events that started like any other night but culminated in horrifying violence. Sade Robinson was ambitious and full of potential. She was a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, held 2 jobs, and was actively shaping her future. That future was taken from her. Now, justice has been served. Sentencing is scheduled for August 15th, but for her loved ones, the real sentence is something far greater: life without her. It was March the 25th, 2022 in Mayfield, a quiet suburb of Newcastle, Australia. 21-year-old Mackenzie Anderson, known as Max to her friends, was at home in her modest apartment on Crebot Street. She was a young mother, her life revolving around her 23-month-old son. Around 10:40 p.m., a frantic call reached the local police. A neighbor, startled by screams, reported a disturbance at Mackenzie's apartment. The police rushed to the scene. When they arrived at the Mayfield Street apartment, they found a horrific scene. Mackenzie was born and raised in Newcastle, New South Wales, in a close-knit family. Her mother, Tabitha Ackret, a dental hygienist, was a pillar of support. Their bond was evident in the heartfelt tributes Tabitha later shared. Mackenzie was also close to her stepfather and friends, who described her as the heart of their circle. She had a knack for making people laugh, often sharing snippets of her life on social media, where her TikTok videos captured her humor and strength as a young mother. Her son was her world, and she poured her energy into creating a stable life for him despite the hardships she faced. Mackenzie's life hadn't been easy. By her early 20s, she was navigating the challenges of single motherhood while living in a modest unit on Crebot Street. Friends said she was determined to break free from a cycle of hardship, working to provide for her son and dreaming of a brighter future. Her relationship with Tyrone Thompson, her ex-partner, cast a long shadow over her life. The two began dating in late 2019, and their off-again relationship was marked by turbulence. By October 2021, Thompson had been jailed for assaulting Mackenzie, intimidating her, and damaging her property. An apprehended violence order was in place, meant to keep Thompson away from Mackenzie, prohibiting any contact or visits to her home. He served a short sentence with a non-parole period of just over 4 months and was released on March 9, 2022. Mackenzie's friends later revealed Mackenzie lived in constant fear, convinced Thompson would come after her once he was free. Then, she messaged a friend, saying that Tyrone had just gotten out of jail and was still being weird, harassing her. Despite the AVO, Thompson reached out to Mackenzie almost immediately after his release, calling her and sending messages from multiple social media accounts. One heartbreaking detail emerged later. Mackenzie had ordered for a new set of knives for Christmas 2021, a practical gift for her home. Those same knives would later become part of the tragedy. The night of March 25, 2022, started like any other in the quiet suburb of Mayfield. But beneath the surface of this ordinary night, a tragedy was unfolding. Mackenzie's apartment on Mayfield was a small, unassuming unit in a block of flats, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by sight, even by name. That evening, she wasn't alone. A male friend, whose identity was closely guarded in early reports, was with her, along with her 23-month-old son, who was likely asleep in his crib. Tyrone Thompson, her ex-partner, was also present at some point during the night, despite the apprehended violence order that barred him from contacting her or visiting her home. The details of how Thompson ended up at her apartment remain murky, but court records later revealed that he had been asked to leave multiple times that evening. His refusal to comply set the stage for what would become a devastating confrontation. In panic, a neighbor dialed emergency services, describing a scene that sounded dire: a woman's voice in distress, a man's voice shouting, and the unmistakable sense that something was terribly wrong. The urgency was clear enough to prompt an immediate response from the Newcastle City Police District. When police arrived at the apartment block, they were met with a harrowing sight. Mackenzie lay lifeless on the veranda outside her unit, her body surrounded by blood. The scene was chaotic, with paramedics soon joining the officers in a frantic attempt to save her. Despite their best efforts, Mackenzie was pronounced dead at the scene. Her injuries were too severe to overcome. Her toddler son, found inside the apartment, was mercifully unharmed. Police found a man at the scene, later identified as Tyrone Thompson, sitting cross-legged at the top of the communal stairs, his hand bloodied and injured. He was loud and demanding medical attention for his wound. A broken knife handle and blade were found near Mackenzie, stark evidence of the brutality that had unfolded. Thompson was arrested and taken to hospital under police guard for treatment of his injury. The tragedy was the culmination of events that had been building for weeks. After his release from prison on March 9, 2022, Thompson immediately breached the apprehended violence order. He began contacting Mackenzie, calling her, messaging her from multiple social media accounts, and even reaching out to people close to her new partner. Court documents later revealed that Mackenzie had spent much of the previous 6 days with Thompson. Despite her fear of him, friends said she felt trapped, unsure how to break free from his persistent attempts to reconnect. That night, Thompson and a male friend were among those gathered at her apartment. Though the exact dynamics remain unclear, tensions escalated. The male friend, who had left earlier in the evening, returned to check on her, only to witness a horrific scene. Thompson standing over Mackenzie, who was already on the ground. Investigators later learned that Mackenzie had been trying to protect herself in the days leading up to that night. She had reached out to domestic violence advocacy groups, emailing them to request help with security measures like cameras and reinforced doors. The night of March 25th wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, but the culmination of a pattern of control and intimidation. Yet, the system allowed him back into her life just 16 days before her death. The AVO, meant to be her shield, was little more than a piece of paper. The Newcastle City Police District launched a meticulous investigation to uncover what had happened in those chaotic final moments. The investigation began at the crime scene itself. Detectives meticulously combed through Mackenzie's apartment, cataloging every detail. The veranda where her body was found was a focal point, marked by bloodstains and the shattered remnants of a knife. Forensic teams collected the fragments, knowing they could hold critical clues about the weapon and its wielder. Inside the apartment, officers found signs of a disturbance: overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and traces of blood that hinted at a confrontation that had moved from inside to the veranda. Digital evidence also became a cornerstone of the investigation. Mackenzie's phone and social media accounts revealed a trail of fear and desperation. Investigators found messages between Mackenzie and Thompson showing they had been in contact since his release. Some exchanges were tense, others oddly amicable, suggesting a complex dynamic. Thompson had also messaged people close to Mackenzie's new partner, attempting to gather information or assert control. These communications, pulled from servers and referenced with phone records, showed he had breached the AVO multiple times. Detectives also explored Mackenzie's broader relationships. They interviewed her mother, Tabitha, who shared her daughter's fears about Thompson. In a statement to the court, later reported by the Newcastle Herald, Tabitha said, "Mackenzie lived in constant fear after Thompson's release." Mackenzie told Tabitha he wouldn't let her go. Friends echoed this, describing how Mackenzie had confided in them about Thompson's persistent attempts to reconnect. One friend told police she wanted to protect her son but felt trapped, like there was no way out. During police questioning, Thompson's statements were guarded but revealing. According to court reports, later cited by the Newcastle Herald, he claimed the incident was a chaotic misunderstanding. He admitted to being at Mackenzie's apartment that night despite the AVO but insisted he had been invited. He described an argument that escalated, alleging that Mackenzie had been the aggressor, wielding a knife in a heated moment. His account painted a picture of self-defense, claiming his hand injury came from trying to disarm her. Though his story shifted under scrutiny, with inconsistencies about the sequence of events, he denied any intent to harm her. However, his explanation struggled to align with the physical evidence. The broken knife, Mackenzie's fatal injuries, and witness accounts of her desperation to escape. Detectives pressed Thompson about his actions in the days leading up to the incident, confronting him with evidence of his repeated AVO breaches, including messages and calls to Mackenzie and her associate. Thompson downplayed these breaches, claiming he was trying to sort things out and maintain a connection for the sake of their shared history. As Thompson remained in custody, the investigation continued to solidify the case. Forensic reports confirmed Mackenzie's blood on the knife and Thompson's DNA on the handle, strengthening the link to the crime. The autopsy of Mackenzie Anderson revealed she suffered 78 stab wounds inflicted in less than 3 minutes. On March 27, 2022, Thompson was formally charged with murder, breaching an AVO, and related offenses stemming from the events of that night. The murder charge was anchored by compelling evidence, knife fragments bearing Mackenzie's blood, witness accounts of her screams, and Thompson's presence at the scene with a suspicious injury. Additional charges included intimidating behavior, reflecting his pattern of harassment in the weeks prior. The motive, while not explicitly stated by Thompson, emerged through the investigation's findings. Detectives and domestic violence experts consulted concluded Thompson's actions stemmed from a need to regain control of Mackenzie, who was trying to move on with her life and protect her son. The presence of Mackenzie's male friend that night may have been a catalyst, intensifying Thompson's fixation. The charges against Thompson were a step toward justice. They also highlighted the failures that allowed him to remain a threat. By early 2025, the case had reached a critical juncture in the Newcastle Supreme Court, where the pursuit of justice for the 21-year-old mother unfolded. Initially set for a 4-week trial starting April 7, 2025, the case took a dramatic turn when Tyrone Thompson, then 25, changed his plea on April 1, 2025 in the New South Wales Supreme Court. He pleaded guilty to the domestic violence murder of Mackenzie Anderson, halting the need for a full trial. This plea came after years of denials, during which he had maintained his innocence even as evidence mounted against him. The guilty plea was a significant moment, sparing Mackenzie's family the pain of a protracted trial, but shifting the focus to the sentencing hearing, where the court would determine the consequences of his actions. The hearing, presided over by Justice Richard Weinstein, became a pivotal moment for all involved. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Brendan Queenan, presented a harrowing case. They argued that Thompson's actions on March 25, 2022, were a brutal culmination of a pattern of control and violence. Court documents detailed how Thompson, on parole for prior domestic violence offenses against Mackenzie, ignored an apprehended violence order and broke into her Mayfield apartment twice that night, using 2 kitchen knives He stabbed her 78 times in less than 3 minutes, an attack so ferocious that one knife snapped. The prosecution emphasized Mackenzie's vulnerability, noting her repeated attempts to seek safety through advocacy groups and her fear that Thompson would harm her after his release. The defense, representing Thompson, acknowledged the gravity of his actions, but sought leniency by highlighting mitigating factors. They argued that Thompson's mental health issues and challenging background diminished his moral culpability. His legal team submitted that he was not psychotic at the time of the crime, but struggled with emotional instability, which contributed to the escalation. Then, an apology letter from Thompson was tendered, in which he expressed regret, stating, "No words can undo the pain and devastation he caused to someone he genuinely loved." However, the prosecution challenged this, with Queenan noting there is some element of victim blaming. Justice Weinstein, wary of the letter's sincerity, remarked that it offered limited insight into true remorse. On May 1st, 2025, Justice Weinstein delivered the sentence. Thompson was jailed for a maximum of 22 years 6 months, with a non-parole period of 15 years 6 months, making him eligible for parole in 2038. The judge described the attack as a frenzied act of such ferocity that it left Mackenzie's family shattered. Noting their helplessness, despair, and anger, he acknowledged the aggravating factors, including Thompson's prior violence and Mackenzie's fear, but also considered his guilty plea and personal circumstances when setting the term. The sentence sparked immediate outrage from Mackenzie's family, particularly her mother, Tabitha Ackert. Outside the Newcastle Supreme Court, she collapsed in tears, telling reporters that whilst it might be thought of as a good outcome for the courts, they were disgusted that that sentence was what they thought the value of her daughter's life was worth. She called the sentence an insult to women globally and demanded an appeal. On May 14, 2025, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions announced it would appeal Thompson's sentence, arguing that it was manifestly inadequate given the severity of the crime. Tabitha welcomed the decision, stating, "This is the first hurdle to getting a sentence that is more in line with community and moral standards." The appeal, set for a 2-hour hearing in the Court of Criminal Appeal on August 8, 2025, aims to increase Thompson's jail time. Prosecutors are citing the need to set a stronger precedent against domestic violence offenders. The case's current status leaves Thompson in prison, awaiting the appeal's outcome. While Mackenzie's family continues their advocacy, the appeal could reshape the sentence, but no verdict can undo the loss. For Mackenzie's son, now in the care of relatives and her loved ones, the fight is as much about honoring her memory as it is about ensuring others don't suffer the same fate. The question lingers: will the legal system deliver a punishment that reflects the true cost of Mackenzie's life, or will it fall short again? A warm summer night in July 1997, in a quiet neighborhood in Whittier, California, the kind of place where violence never happens. On a deserted street in the middle of the night, gunshots pierced the silence. When police arrived, they found a chaotic scene. Bruce Cleland, a respected software engineer, lying in a pool of blood. It quickly became clear that this was no random act of violence. It was something more planned, deliberate, and sinister. Bruce Cleland was born on March 31, 1954, in South Pasadena, California. He grew up in an affluent neighborhood with his older sister, surrounded by comfort and opportunity. Both of his parents were highly educated, financially secure, with strong signs of family wealth from earlier generations. From the outside, the Clelands looked like the perfect family: accomplished parents, well-raised children, and a bright future. Bruce was exceptionally intelligent from a young age. However, as a teenager, he discovered that his intelligence couldn't shield him from being treated cruelly. In 1968, he began attending South Pasadena High School, where his appearance and mannerisms made him a target for bullying. He was often teased and mockingly nicknamed Tiny Tim, after the entertainer known for his unusual voice and eccentric personality. For Bruce, the nickname cut deeper than just a jab at his slight build and soft-spoken voice. It symbolized how others saw him: gentle, awkward, and easy to dismiss. Yet instead of lashing out, Bruce endured the teasing with quiet resilience. He rarely showed anger and often coped by laughing at himself. His shy, reserved nature left him vulnerable. Throughout high school, he never dated, and his classmates thought he was weak. Still, he formed a small circle of close friends who appreciated his intelligence, kind personality. At home, his father, Harold Cleland, was his greatest supporter. The two shared a special bond, attending air shows and football games together, moments that gave Bruce a sense of belonging and strength. Romance intrigued him, but his lack of confidence kept him from pursuing relationships. Believing rejection was inevitable, he focused on academics instead. Science and technology became his refuge. Physics, mathematics, and computers fascinated him. His dedication paid off. By the time he graduated in June 1972, Bruce ranked among the top students in his class. He went on to attend Harvey Mudd College in Claremont, California, one of the country's most prestigious science and engineering schools. There, he experimented with social life, parties, beer, new friendships, but never let distractions interfere with his studies. In June 1976, he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree and soon entered Stanford University, where he earned his master's degree in 1978. With his education complete, Bruce launched a successful career. He first worked at General Electric in San Jose, California, before later joining TRW as a software engineer. His projects were highly technical and sometimes involved classified contracts with the United States military. In 1987, Bruce transferred within the company and relocated to Redondo Beach. By then, he was earning over $100,000 a year, a remarkable salary at the time. Yet despite his income, Bruce lived simply. He drove modest cars, avoided luxury, and invested carefully in savings and stocks. For him, practicality always outweighed status, and by the late 1982, he had quietly built substantial personal wealth. Colleagues admired Bruce for his discipline and frugality. Every decision he made, whether financial or personal, reflected a thoughtful, methodical character. By the 1992, he was in his 40s, financially secure, and respected in his field. The shy teenager, once mocked in high school, had grown into a man with stability and confidence. Yet in matters of the heart, Bruce still seemed paralyzed. Years of solitude and inexperience left him uncertain and hesitant when it came to love. All of that changed in late 1995. That year, Bruce met a woman who would alter the course of his life, Rebecca. Their paths crossed at a local swap meet where Rebecca was selling spices. For Bruce, who had never been much of a dater, the encounter was electric. Captivated by her beauty and charm, he clumsily tried to impress her, even offering the idea of a job at an IT company. Rebecca handed him her resume. Soon afterward, Bruce called her. A relationship began. From the start, Rebecca's intentions appeared unusually direct. Within a week of meeting, she suggested marriage. For Bruce, who had never experienced such attention from a woman, the proposal was overwhelming yet deeply flattering. Eager for love, he agreed. Stepping blindly into his first serious relationship, Rebecca wasted no time. She introduced him to her 5-year-old son, claiming she had no contact with the boy's father and did not even know his identity. Almost immediately, she leaned on Bruce for financial support, Complaining about her living situation, she accepted his offer to rent her an apartment. Bruce furnished it, covered expenses, and even bought her a car. At first, it was a used Honda, but soon he upgraded it to a new Toyota after her persuasion. Over time, the requests grew bolder. Cosmetic surgery, jewelry, even a boat. For Bruce, who had spent years carefully saving, generosity felt like love. For Rebecca, it became a test of how much she could extract. Rebecca insisted on waiting until marriage for physical intimacy, something he interpreted as a sign of morality and self-respect. She claimed she had only ever been with one man, the father of her child. To Bruce, this made her unique, someone worth protecting and sacrificing for. When it came time to choose an engagement ring, Rebecca selected an extravagant diamond worth $10,000. Despite his normally cautious nature with money, Bruce eagerly paid. Soon after, she set her sights on a 4-bedroom house near Los Angeles, priced at $350,000, an enormous commitment for the mid-negative 1,990 seconds. Bruce purchased it, believing it was a gesture of love and security. They had a wedding in October 1996, but Rebecca wanted more. She envisioned a lavish church ceremony in January 1997, one she felt would showcase her true worth. Until then, she suggested that she and her son move into the new house, while Bruce wait until the church wedding before joining them. To Bruce, this seemed like a sign of tradition and respect. In reality, Rebecca had already discovered his greatest weakness, his innocence. She knew he was inexperienced with women, defenseless against manipulation, and utterly flattered by her attention. What Bruce saw as love, Rebecca quickly turned into leverage. But who was Rebecca, really? Her story had begun long before she ever met Bruce. Her mother, Lucy, grew up in Mexico, where she endured abuse that led to an early pregnancy. Pressured by her family to marry her abuser to avoid shame, Lucy entered a doomed marriage plagued by instability and poverty. Seeking escape, the family eventually immigrated to the United States, hoping for a better life. On August 15, 1969, Rebecca Salcedo was born in California, the third daughter in a family already marked by hardship. Her father abandoned the household when she was still a child, leaving her mother, Lucy, to shoulder the burden of raising 3 daughters alone. Years later, the family discovered that he had died, but by then, Lucy had long been forced into the dual role of provider and caregiver. Life in California was expensive, and though the extended family sometimes helped, money was always scarce. Eventually, Lucy remarried. Her new husband, Pedro Salcedo, accepted the girls as his own and tried to bring stability to the home. Still, Pedro was not wealthy, and the family's lifestyle remained modest, with every dollar carefully stretched just to cover essentials. Even with Pedro's support, Lucy's mental health began to unravel. Withdrawn and overwhelmed, she increasingly retreated from daily responsibilities. This left her daughters with little structure or guidance. Instead of a cohesive, supportive household, tension became the norm. The sisters quarreled constantly, competing against one another rather than working together. In this chaotic atmosphere, Rebecca quickly realized she could live without real authority over her. She came and went as she pleased, shaping her own rules. As Rebecca entered her teenage years, she embraced a lifestyle centered on attention, popularity, and freedom. Schoolwork became secondary. She preferred parties, shopping trips, and the thrill of being noticed. With natural charm and striking looks, she quickly learned that she could bend situations to her advantage. Boys offered her rides, gifts, and money, benefits she rarely turned down. By age 16, she took her independence to another level. She agreed to marry a man who desperately needed a green card. As a U.S. citizen, she could provide it, and in return, she received $2 This marriage of convenience marked a turning point. It was the first in a long series of calculated decisions where relationships became a means of survival, opportunity, and profit. The early 1992s introduced even greater turmoil. In 1991, Rebecca was arrested on charges of possession of illegal substances with intent to sell. The conviction resulted in a 3-year prison sentence. Around the same time, she discovered she was pregnant. When asked about the father, she admitted she had no idea who he was. On October 22, 1991, while still behind bars, she gave birth to a son. Her family cared for the child during her incarceration. Though sentenced to 3 years, she was released after roughly a year and a half for good behavior. This dark chapter would later be completely hidden from Bruce Cleland, who never suspected the reality of her past. Upon leaving prison, Rebecca faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding her life. No job, no degree, and the responsibility of a young child, but she soon entered a relationship that offered emotional refuge. Her partner was Sherry, a former police officer. To those who knew Rebecca at the time, Sherry seemed to be her true love. Rebecca even had Sherry's name tattooed on her leg as a permanent sign of commitment. For several years, from 1991 to 1994, Rebecca, Sherry, and her son built a life together. It was perhaps the most stable and genuinely happy period Rebecca ever experienced. That sense of stability was abruptly shattered in 1994. Lucy, long plagued by mental illness, took her own life. The tragedy devastated Rebecca. Friends and family noticed a dramatic change in her behavior. Once relatively steady, she became volatile, argumentative, and unpredictable. Her relationship with Sherry began to crumble under constant fights, infidelity, and Rebecca's return to partying. By the end of the year, the bond was broken. Rebecca once again found herself untethered, drifting from one social circle to another, seeking someone new to provide the security and attention she craved. It was in this vulnerable and unstable period that Rebecca crossed paths with Bruce Cleland. To her, Bruce represented something she had been seeking for years, a man who was gentle, trusting, and financially secure. She immediately recognized his naivety in matters of love and knew how to craft a persona that would appeal to him. She presented herself as principled, loyal, and morally upright. To Rebecca, Bruce was the perfect target, wealthy, inexperienced, and eager to please. Bruce, captivated by love, completely trusted Rebecca. He bought a house, looking forward to them living together. But the house quickly became a busy center of activity. Rebecca invited friends over frequently, hosted parties, and entertained men whom she introduced as cousins. Bruce never questioned her explanations. His deep trust, combined with his lack of relationship experience, left him unable to see what was happening right in front of him. In January 1997, their lavish church wedding finally took place. A ceremony designed to match Rebecca's ambitions and to project an image of perfection. To the outside world, they seemed like a success story. Bruce, the accomplished, intelligent professional, and Rebecca, the devoted young wife. But appearances were deceiving. At her bachelorette party, just days before the ceremony, Rebecca confided to friends that she didn't love Bruce at all. Her marriage, she admitted, was about one thing only: money. Bruce and Rebecca traveled to Hawaii for their honeymoon, but the trip only highlighted how fragile their union truly was. Even then, Rebecca could not hide her disdain. She called friends and ridiculed her new husband, describing her intimate life with him in cruel detail, saying it was the most humiliating experience of her life. Many hoped marriage might soften Rebecca, that with time she would grow into the role of a loyal partner, especially with a man as devoted as Bruce. He continued to shower her with kindness, patience, and loyalty, but Rebecca never even pretended to reciprocate. Once back from Hawaii, the thin facade of marriage crumbled entirely. Rebecca returned to late nights, wild parties, and lavish spending, burning through Bruce's money as though it were endless. Her infidelity was no secret. She saw other men openly, and while friends noticed, Bruce seemed unwilling, or unable, to confront the truth. Instead, he retreated into his work, spending less time at home and leaving Rebecca free to indulge in her desires. Within just 4 months of their wedding, the situation was irreparably broken. Rebecca began talking openly about divorce, boasting to her friends about the large settlement she expected to secure. What she failed to understand, however, was California's clear legal boundary. The fortune Bruce had carefully built before their marriage would remain his. Still, Rebecca pressed forward, determined to turn the marriage into profit. The first public cracks appeared in April when police were called to their home after a heated, loud argument spilled out of control. For Bruce, the tension and stress became unbearable. Naturally calm and soft-spoken, he was not a man prone to anger, but being forced out of his own home was a breaking point. He left the house and sought legal advice, slowly beginning to recognize what he had long denied. Rebecca's affections were never real. She was motivated purely by money. The division of assets after their split was not what she expected. Rebecca's dreams went up in smoke. Because Bruce had purchased his home and accumulated wealth before marriage, those assets were legally protected. The only amount subject to division totaled around $5,000, a devastating blow to her expectations. To Rebecca, it felt like an insult, yet she wasn't ready to let go. Even after their separation, she continued using Bruce's credit cards without permission. Designer clothing, glittering jewelry, nights at upscale restaurants, beauty treatments, and party expenses all found their way onto his statements. From the outside, Rebecca maintained the image of glamour and abundance. In reality, it was Bruce's steady paycheck that still fueled her lifestyle. Meanwhile, Bruce moved back into his parents' home. His attorney advised him to sever ties completely, to cut Rebecca off for good. But Bruce, hopeful to a fault, clung to the possibility that their marriage might be salvaged. Rebecca, ever calculating, sensed his weakness and dangled the idea of reconciliation. On the morning of Friday, July 25, 1997, she called him with a suggestion. Perhaps they could start over. To Bruce, it was the one thing he had longed to hear. That evening, they arranged to meet at the same restaurant where they had first gone on a date. Bruce picked her up, and by 9:30 p.m., they were seated together, sharing dinner. An hour later, they were back on the road. At Rebecca's urging, they stopped by her uncle's house, a man she often described as a father figure. The visit seemed ordinary, calm even. Around 1 o'clock a.m., they said their goodbyes and drove off. Rebecca was behind the wheel when their car pulled onto a quiet, isolated stretch of road. She suddenly claimed she needed to step out and check the tailgate. Bruce, sitting in the passenger seat, waited. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. The stillness of the night shattered as gunshots rang out. Bruce was struck and scrambled out of the car, attempting to flee, but another shot tore into his back. He collapsed to the ground, helpless, as the killer closed in and delivered a final shot to his head from the window of a nearby house. a woman named Virginia Selva caught a glimpse of the horror unfolding outside. Horrified, she immediately dialed 911. When police arrived, they found Bruce lying, lifeless, only feet from his car. Rebecca was seated near the hood, claiming she had been struck in the head and knocked unconscious, but detectives noticed something strange from the very start. Rebecca showed no panic, no tears, no shock. Instead, she calmly offered an explanation. It must have been a robbery. She even insisted that her diamond wedding ring had been stolen, yet investigators quickly noticed the inconsistencies. Her purse and cell phone remained untouched inside the car. Bruce's wallet, with cash inside, was still in his pocket. A medical examination showed she had no head injuries. When Rebecca sat down with investigators, her statements immediately struck detectives as odd. Rather than focusing on her husband's violent death, she spoke at length about her outfit that evening, their first date years earlier, and the restaurant they had just visited. None of it addressed the brutality of what had happened on that road. Detectives grew increasingly skeptical. A closer look at her background and at the short marriage itself quickly revealed troubling signs. Friends and acquaintances described a woman obsessed with material wealth, prone to extravagant spending, unfaithful to her husband, and openly dissatisfied with the marriage from the very beginning. Then came the discovery that shattered any lingering doubts. Just 1 month before Bruce's murder, Rebecca had quietly taken out multiple life insurance policies in his name, totaling roughly $1 million. On the documents, Bruce's signature had been crudely forged. If he were to die, Rebecca stood to inherit everything: his house, his possessions, and the insurance payout. Investigators also learned that Bruce was a man without enemies. No grudges, no disputes, no history of violence, but witnesses near the crime scene recalled something else. They had seen a young Latino male in the area that night. Detectives turned to Rebecca's phone records. One name stood out immediately: Alvaro Quesada, her cousin. He matched the witness description. The evidence trail closed in quickly. Under interrogation, Alvaro confessed to being the gunman. He admitted he had ambushed Bruce at Rebecca's request. His brother, José Quesada, also confessed to participating in the crime. Both men independently pointed to Rebecca as the orchestrator, the mastermind who had manipulated them into carrying out the killing. The case proceeded to trial. In June 2000, Rebecca Cleland, along with Alvaro Quesada and José Quesada, were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury determined the crime involved special circumstances, financial gain, and lying in wait. Rebecca showed no remorse throughout the proceedings. In 2003, she received her sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, she remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona. Alvaro and Jose are also serving life sentences in California state prisons. For Bruce's parent, the verdict provided accountability but little comfort. From the start, they had sensed something was wrong. They had pleaded with their son not to marry Rebecca, worried she cared only for his money. In the months following the wedding, they watched helplessly as his once bright spirit dimmed. Bruce eventually confided that he planned to file for divorce, but by then, Rebecca's plan was already in motion. Bruce Cleland's life had always been defined by quiet, determination, and deep kindness. First in his studies, then in his career, and above all, in the love he showed to family and friends. His murder at the hands of the woman he trusted most left everyone who knew him devastated. As his father later remarked with sorrowful certainty, she planned it from the beginning. The story of Bruce Cleland remains a haunting reminder of how trust can be betrayed, how greed can corrupt love into something deadly, and how one man's simple, dignified life was stolen by someone who saw him only as a means to an end. November 11, 2013, a cold autumn evening in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Along a quiet stretch of road near the Susquehanna Valley Mall, the silence was broken when two local residents discovered something on the ground. A man lay face down, completely motionless. His clothes were soaked in blood, and his belongings were scattered around him. The faint glow of his phone screen still lit up the night. Emergency responders arrived quickly. It was immediately clear this wasn't an accident. The man had been stabbed multiple times, his body showing unmistakable signs of a brutal attack. The number of wounds suggested this wasn't random violence, but a calculated killing, designed to make sure he would not survive. No car was nearby. There were no obvious tire marks, just a few footprints leading toward the road, partly blurred by recent rain. The area was sparsely populated, and no one had witnessed the attack. Under grey skies and damp air, police began piecing together what they could. The victim's phone gave them their first lead. It wasn't locked, and investigators quickly saw calls from the night before. 2 incoming, 1 outgoing. The last number dialed wasn't saved in his contacts. There is nothing else to go on. It didn't take long to confirm the man's identity. He was Troy LaFerrara, 42 years old, an electrical engineer from nearby. Police didn't release much information publicly right away, but they knew one thing for certain. Troy had not been chosen at random. The killer had lured him here. To understand how the story reached this point, you have to go back almost 2 decades and more than 3,000 miles away to North Pole, Alaska. Despite its festive name and candy cane lampposts, life there is anything but cheerful. Winters can plunge below 15 degrees below zero, and fewer than 3,000 residents endure the isolation and relentless cold. It was in this environment that Miranda Barber was born in 1994. Her parents' relationship quickly fell apart, leaving her mother, Elizabeth Dean, to raise Miranda and her older sister, Ashley, mostly on her own. Their father remained distant. As a child, Miranda was diagnosed with a congenital hip disorder. The joint hadn't formed correctly, leaving her in pain, limiting her ability to walk and play. For 2 years, she was forced to wear a corrective brace, a reminder of the physical struggles she faced from an early age. Eventually, the family moved closer to Elizabeth's relatives. Miranda often visited her sister's home, where she lived with her husband, Richard Fernandez. Miranda and Ashley, just 5 and 6 years old, often spent time there after school. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but behind closed doors, Richard revealed a much darker side. Over several years, he abused both girls in ways too disturbing to imagine. He threatened them, manipulated their silence, and instilled a deep fear that kept them from speaking out. They carried the burden in silence, never telling even their mother. That silence broke when Ashley finally confided in Elizabeth. The revelation devastated her, but she acted immediately, taking both daughters to the authorities. Richard was arrested. He was convicted and sentenced to 19 years in prison. Though he was later released early, he offended again and was sent back to prison, where he remains today. However, Richard's arrest didn't erase the trauma he left behind. Healing was slow, if it happened at all. Miranda became distant, anxious, and emotionally fragile, while Elizabeth began to unravel under the weight of it all. Her dependence on alcohol and other substances worsened, and her mood grew increasingly unstable. At times, she tried to be present for her daughters, but those efforts were inconsistent and often ineffective. The home environment collapsed into emotional chaos, made worse by financial strain and the lack of any outside support. It felt as though all three were trapped in a downward spiral. When Miranda turned 9, Elizabeth made a drastic decision. They left North Pole. She wanted a fresh start, but moving away was easier than escaping the past. Ashley kept her distance, focusing on school, part-time jobs, and friends as a way to avoid the dysfunction at home. Miranda reacted differently. She withdrew inward, spending more time alone, moody and volatile. Her behavior increasingly unpredictable. By age 12, Miranda entered a new phase. She began spending time with an older crowd already immersed in smoking, drinking, and banned substance use. Despite being much younger, she slipped into the group with ease. At first, she only watched, but soon she joined in cigarettes, alcohol, pills. It quickly became normal. She started disappearing for hours or days at a time. Often, her mother didn't notice. Or if she did, her reaction was muted. Miranda would drift back home without explanation, and no one pressed for answers. School became another battleground. Her attitude grew combative. She picked fights, hurled insults, and lashed out at peers and teachers. Multiple suspensions followed. Her academics stalled, and her behavior worsened in every direction. It was around this period that Miranda began talking about someone named Forrest, a man she described as being in his 20s. She claimed he belonged to a group that practiced dark, ritualistic ceremonies, and that after participating in one of their rites, she belonged to him. She told her mother about these encounters. Elizabeth tried to intervene, forbidding Miranda from further contact. Miranda's response was to ignore. The existence of Forrest was never verified. Authorities later found no records, no witnesses, no tangible sign of such a group. To outsiders, it seemed like one of Miranda's fabrications, stories she often told when she felt neglected. But to her, it appeared real. She spoke and acted as though she had been changed by him. Her fascination with ritual, submission, and sacrifice deepened. In her mind, this was the moment she lost control. At home, there was no stability, and at school no one intervened. Miranda was in freefall. By 14, her behavior had become dangerously volatile. Her moods swung wildly, and her relationships with others were increasingly toxic. At one point, she attempted self-harm. The details were kept private, but it was serious enough to require medical attention. For the first and only time, her biological father stepped in, not to provide support, but simply to sign the paperwork that allowed her admission to a psychiatric facility. He played no further role. During her stay, Miranda was diagnosed with depressive disorder and prescribed medication. Doctors recommended ongoing therapy, but her time there was short. Once discharged, she returned to the same unstable home, her mother still struggling with addiction, her sister occupied with her own life. No adult provided consistent guidance or care. She never went back to school in any meaningful way. Although she was technically still in school, she stopped attending. Her education effectively ended. Instead, she drifted further into the company of older friends, her social circle shifting constantly. Her lifestyle aged her prematurely, not in maturity, but in exposure to danger. She kept using banned substance, sought out risky situations, and frequently stayed away from home. There were no steady relationships, no anchors. By the time Miranda was 17, she discovered she was pregnant. Even she was unsure who the father was. There were several possibilities, but no certainty. Still, she chose to continue the pregnancy. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe a desire to hold on to something that felt real. Despite the chaos around her, the pregnancy went ahead without major complications. Though she received little medical care, on schedule, she gave birth to a baby girl she named Aria. With Aria's arrival, Miranda now had someone she was directly responsible for. But instead of bringing stability, motherhood brought new complications. The family's situation deteriorated quickly. Elizabeth was in deep crisis. Ashley had already moved out, and social services became involved to review custody. Given Miranda's young age and Elizabeth's instability, the authorities determined she couldn't raise Aria alone. Guardianship was transferred to relatives living in North Carolina. On paper, it was a fresh start. But the damage inside Miranda didn't disappear. Aria became her anchor, but not her cure. In North Carolina, Miranda and her baby moved in with distant relatives. The environment appeared more stable. Child services approved the placement and scheduled regular visits. But beneath the surface, Miranda felt detached. Once again, she withdrew. It was in this house that she met Elit Barber. He was 20 at the time and often visited because of his close friendship with one of the family members. Elit already had a girlfriend, Amy, who was expecting their child. Miranda, meanwhile, was caring for newborn Aria. Despite their circumstances, Miranda and Elit connected almost immediately. Elit had a fascination with unusual beliefs. He talked openly about cults, rituals, and symbolic power, not as fantasy, but as something real to him. Instead of dismissing it, Miranda leaned in. Her past claims of involvement with a supposed ritualistic group seemed to draw them closer. They discussed sacrifice, control, and the meaning of power, not as stories, but as shared truths. At first, Amy didn't view Miranda as a threat. The two even spent time together, walking their babies side by side. But their differences soon became obvious. Amy wanted stability. Miranda didn't. She thrived on risk and embraced conversations others would avoid. Elit began pulling away from Amy, and not long after their child was born, Amy left. She took the baby with her, ending the relationship without much explanation. Whatever the reason, the split was final. Elit stayed with Miranda. From there, their bond deepened quickly. Before long, they were living together. Their conversations about rituals became less abstract, more personal, even practical. They convinced themselves they shared something rare, different from everyone else. Their world narrowed to just the two of them. Decisions were made together. Outsiders' opinions meant nothing. They isolated themselves, spending nearly all their time alone, and spoke often about creating something meaningful, not a family or a future, but something unique, belonging only to them. Within months, Miranda and Elit married. There was no celebration, no relatives present. Most family members disapproved anyway, because of their instability, their banned substance use, and their obsession with dark themes. But they wasn't looking for approval. To them, the marriage was an act of defiance, not a tradition. After the wedding, they chose to leave North Carolina behind. Neither had steady work or prospects. Elit had little job experience. Miranda had no education, and supporting themselves seemed impossible. They wanted to escape family, expectations, and society altogether. Their destination was Port Trevorton, a tiny, isolated community in Pennsylvania. Elit knew someone there who offered them a place to stay temporarily. The town had fewer than 500 residents, no public transportation, and limited infrastructure. But for Miranda and Elit, it was perfect. No attention, no oversight, no one watching. Together with Aria, they moved into the friend's home, rent-free, retreating further into their own world. But money ran out quickly. They survived on food and essentials provided by odd jobs and the generosity of their host. Elit tried to find steady work, sending out resumes and attending interviews, but nothing came of it. His lack of experience, his demeanor, even his appearance seemed to work against him. Miranda took a different route. She turned to an online classified site, a place where people posted everything from furniture, sales, to services. She created a profile, offering herself as a companion, not in an intimate sense, but for company at social events, dinners, and outings. She insisted she had done it before and didn't consider it shameful. A response came almost immediately. A man named Troy LaFerrara, 42 years old, replied. He was married, employed in the tech industry, and financially comfortable. In his messages, he expressed interest in meeting, but hinted at wanting more than just casual companionship. The amount of money he offered was substantial, far above what Miranda usually saw. That fact alone caught her attention. She showed the messages to Alit, and instead of being bothered, he focused on the money. Together, they began discussing possibilities. What started as a way to earn extra income shifted into something far darker. The idea evolved quickly. The site wasn't just a way to find clients, it was the perfect tool to set a trap. On the surface, Troy looked like a model citizen. A steady job as an engineer at an IT company, a suburban home, and a reputation as a responsible husband. Neighbors thought of him as devoted and respectable. He had no criminal record, no visible issues. But beneath that exterior, Troy was living a double life. Away from his family, he used online platforms to arrange private encounters with women. He regularly browsed ads, messaged profiles, and set up meetings, all while keeping it secret. His family had no idea. When he found Miranda's post, he was intrigued. While her ad didn't explicitly promise anything physical, its tone suggested flexibility. Troy reached out, asking about details, and the conversation soon moved to private messages. He offered payment well above average. That was enough for Miranda to say yes. To Troy, it looked like a discreet arrangement. In reality, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. November 11, 2013. The meeting place was a shopping center parking lot. Troy pulled into the agreed-upon spot. Miranda was already there. He climbed into her car, handed her the money, and settled in. He was calm, relaxed, maybe even comfortable. Their destination had already been chosen, a quiet rural road, far from town, where no one would pass by. In the trunk, hidden under a blanket, illudele una blanque, he waited for Miranda's signal word. The car rolled through the darkness. A few miles out, Miranda slowed and pulled over. She turned to Troy and asked, "Did you see the stars tonight?" That was the cue. A lit burst from the trunk, wrapping electrical wire around Troy's neck. The attack was sudden, but Troy didn't collapse immediately. He fought back with desperate strength, clawing at the wire, even managing to push the door open and get one leg outside. Miranda, seeing headlights approaching in the distance, knew they had little time. She pulled out a knife and stabbed him, again and again, in the chest, stomach, and neck. 20 times in total. The intensity of the attack revealed a deep rage. Troy stopped fighting. Elit slammed the door shut. They drove off, with his body still in the car. After several miles, they turned onto a secluded road. They dragged Troy out, took his wallet, cash, watch, and left the rest. His phone was still there by accident. They dumped the body in a roadside ditch, making no effort to hide it. Afterward, they drove to Walmart. There, they picked up cleaning supplies, bleach, brushes, gloves, and wipes. Every item was paid for in cash. Using money taken from Troy's wallet, they cleaned the car later that night, far from the scene, scrubbing the seats, mats, and doors. The wire used in the attack was discarded along the way. Once finished, they went out to eat. It was Elit's birthday, and they chose a nicer restaurant, ordering full meals and drinks. Again, They paid in cash. By the next morning, life seemed to continue as normal. Neither of them showed signs of fear, panic, or regret. The following morning, Troy LaFerrara's body was found on the side of a rural road. He was partially covered by tall grass, but otherwise left in the open. Scattered nearby were some of his clothes and his cell phone. That phone became the breakthrough. It was still powered on, and recent calls and messages were easy to retrieve. One number appeared multiple times. Investigators traced it to a registered SIM card belonging to Miranda Barber. Detectives went to the address listed with the phone record. Miranda agreed to come to the station, told it was just a routine check linked to Troy's phone activity. During the first interview, she appeared calm, even cooperative. She denied knowing Troy, insisting they had never met. She suggested she might have accidentally answered a call from a stranger, but claimed no knowledge beyond that. When asked about her use of the online classified site, she hesitated briefly before saying she hadn't logged in for months. The interview went on for about an hour, but when detectives asked to look through her phone, her demeanor changed instantly. She refused, saying they would need a warrant. Her tone turned defensive. Officers noted the sudden shift, but lacking grounds to detain her, they let her go. Back at the house where she was staying, Miranda unraveled. Hours later, she admitted to a friend that she had been involved in Troy's death. She provided names, motives, even details of the night. The friend was horrified. He urged her to confess, warning that if she didn't, he would go to the police himself. Around 4:00 a.m., Miranda returned to the station and asked to see the lead investigator. This time, she said she was ready to tell the truth, but immediately reframed it. She claimed the killing had been self-defense. She explained that she met Troy through her ad, but during their encounter, he became aggressive. She said she panicked, grabbed a knife, and stabbed him. She never mentioned the wire. She never mentioned Elite. Her story didn't match the evidence. The sheer number of stab wounds, the strangulation marks, and other signs all pointed to more than one attacker. Investigators knew her account was only the beginning of a series of lies. With Miranda's partial confession on record, attention shifted to Elite Barber. He was at the house when Miranda returned from the station, calm and silent. Even after learning she had admitted involvement with Troy, he didn't appear shaken. Detectives brought him in for questioning. He didn't resist. His answers were brief. He denied knowing about Troy, denied leaving the house that day, denied any involvement. Investigators later obtained surveillance footage from a nearby shopping mall. On the video, just before Miranda's meeting with Troy, a man could be seen climbing into the back seat of her car. The footage was clear enough to confirm it was Elite. When shown the video, his story shifted. In a second interview, Elite admitted his role. He described the plan in detail, explaining that both he and Miranda had agreed on the setup. The wire and the knife had been chosen beforehand. He spoke with no hesitation, no visible emotion. The lead investigator described his tone as detached, almost clinical. A forensic psychologist later observed that even while describing the moment of Troy's death, Elite's voice stayed steady, flat, and completely without remorse. Elite Barber was then formally arrested. When investigators compared their statements, it became clear her self-defense claim didn't hold up. The evidence showed the attack had been planned in advance, coordinated, and deliberately carried out. On the surface, the case seemed clear. One victim, two perpetrators, confessions, and supporting forensic proof. But it shifted after a phone call from jail. Miranda contacted a journalist, not to plead for sympathy or reduce her sentence, but to make a shocking claim. In the interview, she said Troy LaFerrara wasn't her first victim. According to her, there were 22 others. She offered no names, dates, or locations, just a vague statement that she had lost count after 20. The story spread quickly, and headlines labeled her a female serial killer. Police had to take the claim seriously. Investigations were reopened, and Miranda was questioned directly. Who were these victims? Where? When? But her answers remained inconsistent and vague. Authorities checked missing persons cases across several states where she had lived, but nothing matched. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence. Her family soon spoke out. Her father, her sister, and others close to her all described a lifelong pattern of attention-seeking. As a child, Miranda often told elaborate stories that placed herself at the center. They believed this confession was no different, a way for her to control the narrative and stay in the spotlight. Elu, however, seemed to believe her. During one of his recorded interviews, he said Miranda had told him similar stories in private. He described how her personality shifted when she spoke about them, as though she became someone else entirely. He even gave that side of her a name, Super Miranda. To him, it felt like she was possessed by something darker, something he couldn't fully understand. He claimed he sometimes believed he lived with two Mirandas. Eventually, the case moved to trial. The courtroom atmosphere was subdued, no emotional outbursts, no visible remorse. Miranda Barber and Elite Barber stood silently as the judge handed down their sentences. They were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Their expressions, captured on camera, were flat and unreadable. Months later, another tragedy followed. Miranda's mother, Elizabeth, died of an overdose. There was no note left behind. Family members later said she had struggled with mental and emotional instability for years. The collapse of her daughter's life, the public disgrace, and the disintegration of her family pushed her over the edge. She was found alone in her home. As for Miranda's young daughter, Aria, she was first placed in temporary care after her mother's arrest. Following Elizabeth's death in 2016, the state assumed full custody. Very little information about her has been released, apart from one detail: her last name was legally changed for her protection. Her current whereabouts remain undisclosed. In the quiet streets of New Haven, Indiana, what began as an ordinary night between a married couple soon turned into a scene of horror. A blood-soaked staircase, a frantic call to 911, a husband barely clinging to life, his wife's calm voice telling dispatchers he fell, but nothing about that night felt like an accident. The bruises, broken bones, and her unsettling calmness all suggested something more sinister beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage. Friends who once saw Kevin and Allison Davis as the ideal couple began to wonder, had love turned deadly inside their home on Douglas Lane? By morning, Kevin was dead. Allison was a widow and a suspect. What followed was a tangled story of conflicting accounts, haunting evidence, and one question that still divides their Indiana community: was it a tragic fall, or a deliberate murder? Kevin Davis was born on July 1, 1983, to his mother, Alta Beers. From an early age, everyone liked him. His friends described him as kind, hard-working, and always willing to help others. At the age of 40, Kevin worked as a gardener and had a stable life in New Haven, Indiana. One day, he met Allison by chance. They fell in love, got married, and lived together in a house on Douglas Lane. They didn't have children, but adored their pit bull mix, Willow, whom they treated like family. To their friends, Kevin and Allison seemed like a happy couple with a full, active life. Jason Young, a friend of Kevin's, said he could sometimes be loud and opinionated, but it was all part of his personality. Allison worked in retail at Victoria's Secret, where she made everyone feel welcome and valued. She and Kevin often affectionately called each other babe. Everything about their life looked happy and stable. But beneath that surface, something dark was brewing. On the evening of Friday, August 11, 2023, Kevin arrived at East Haven Tavern around 9 p.m. Taking his usual seat at the bar while waiting for Allison to finish work. When she arrived, they greeted each other warmly. Their friend, Jason, was also there, and the three of them enjoyed drinks and laughed all night long. Kevin had a few beers and vodka shots, while Allison sipped her usual sweet cocktail. Bartenders said the night seemed completely ordinary. Around 1 o'clock emission, on August 12, Allison left first, with Kevin following soon after. They both headed home to Douglas Lane, ready to call it a night, but within hours, everything changed. At 1:11 a.m., Kevin texted Jason after getting home. Jason asked if they made it back safely. Kevin apologized and said everything was fine. He was just listening to music. They kept chatting for over an hour, with Kevin sounding cheerful and joking around. Finally, at 2:31 a.m., Kevin sent one last text saying he was going to put his phone on silent because he needed to go to sleep. Between 2:31 a.m. and 4:38 a.m., something terrifying happened inside Kevin and Allison's home. At 4:38 a.m., Allison called 911. The call lasted about a minute. In a calm tone, she told the dispatcher that her husband had just fallen down the stairs, that there was blood everywhere, and that she couldn't flip him over. She added that she didn't know whether he was alive or dead. Detective James Kruger later said the call sounded rehearsed. Allison never asked dispatchers to hurry, and he believed her tone was more focused on herself than on Kevin. Officers Garrett Shainbrook and Corporal Cade Hetrick arrived within minutes. Allison met them outside and led them in. At the bottom of the staircase, they found Kevin lying face down in a large pool of blood. Blood covered the walls, railing, and floor, with spatter reaching high above the stairs. Kevin was barely breathing, with blood flowing from his nose and mouth. His body temperature was 91 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously low compared to the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Corporal Cade Hetrick, who witnessed the scene, commented that this didn't look like a fall to him. There were no signs in the house that suggested a hard fall, nor damaged railings, broken furniture, or dents in the walls. Kevin's body was lying flat, not twisted or wedged, as one might expect from a fall. The amount of blood made Hetrick ask Allison if there were any firearms in the house. Fearing Kevin might have shot himself, Allison confirmed there were firearms, but none were found near Kevin's body. Paramedics rushed Kevin to Parkview Regional Medical Center, but Allison's behavior immediately struck them as unusual. While talking to paramedics, she was laughing. She didn't seem worried about her husband's injuries. No tears, no attempt to ride in the ambulance. Detective Kruger was present at the scene and began the interrogation. Allison said that around 1 o'clock a.m., after returning from the bar, she and Kevin got into an argument. Kevin went upstairs to sleep, and she lay on the living room sofa. She said she woke up to a loud noise and found Kevin lying at the bottom of the stairs, thinking he was just drunk and had fallen. Allison agreed to let Kruger search the house and signed a permit. However, she warned him not to enter a room upstairs because of a guard dog named Willow. She said she did not want to go near that room. Kruger agreed not to enter the room where Willow was staying. When he opened the door slightly, Willow growled and bared her teeth. The dog wouldn't let him in. Other than that, the house appeared normal, and Kruger believed Allison's story that Kevin's fall had been a tragic accident caused by intoxication. The crime scene was cleared the same day. Allison's father, Steve Krauser, came over to clean up the blood wanting to help his daughter in her grief. Meanwhile, Kevin's condition at the hospital worsened. His mother, Alta Beers, had received a text from Allison early that morning saying, "There's been an accident." Alta texted back for details, but got no response and went back to sleep. Assuming it wasn't serious, around 6:30 a.m., Alta finally spoke to Allison by phone and was surprised by how calm she sounded. Allison's tone made Alta believe that everything was fine, but it wasn't. Kevin's friends, Jason and Todd Spessert, hurried to the hospital. They spoke with Allison and her parents. Jason thought Allison had been crying, but was trying to hold herself together. Todd said she looked distraught. Inside Kevin's room, Allison stood by his bedside, calling to him as her father watched helplessly. Kevin suffered his third cardiac arrest that evening. At 10:07 p.m. on August 12, 2023, doctors removed him from life support. 40-year-old Kevin Davis was gone. Allison, 33, was now a widow. Friends were heartbroken. Everyone believed it had to be an accident, a terrible fall. But 3 days later, everything changed. On August 15, 2023, Dr. Scott Wagner performed Kevin's autopsy and discovered devastating injuries. The right side of Kevin's skull was crushed, with several fractures. The injuries were confined to his head. No other trauma was found. Dr. Wagner determined the damage was consistent with a fall from at least 20 feet or a high-speed car crash. The injuries would have rendered Kevin unconscious within seconds and brain-dead upon impact. He concluded that Kevin's wounds could not have been caused by a fall down a normal staircase. The evidence suggested Kevin had been struck in the head with a blunt object. The Allen County Coroner's Office ruled Kevin's death a homicide on October 17, 2023, caused by blunt force trauma to the head. Detective Kruger sat in his office, processing the information. If Kevin was murdered, it meant someone else did it, and the only person with him that night was Allison. Kruger reviewed the text messages between Kevin and Allison. When he read Kevin's last text message to his wife, he felt that there was something unusual about the content, not at all gentle. Kruger sensed tension between them. Then he discovered something even more troubling. Allison had given conflicting accounts of what happened that night. To police, Allison claimed she and Kevin had been drinking and argued after returning home. She said she slept on the couch while Kevin went upstairs. To Kevin's mother, Alta, Allison claimed Kevin had not been drinking and that they had been in bed upstairs when Kevin got up for water and accidentally fell down the stairs. To Kevin's brother, Allison said that she was in bed with her dog, Willow, and heard Kevin moving around but didn't pay attention because Willow was still lying there. She only went to check on Kevin later and found him fallen. And to the medics, Allison said she hadn't heard anything and hadn't seen Kevin for some time before finding his body. The stories contradicted one another, and Kruger believed Allison had been caught lying. Doctors also found something alarming. Kevin's body temperature was so low upon arrival at the hospital that he was hypothermic, and his brain had almost no oxygen. One doctor said she had seen drowning victims with higher oxygen levels than Kevin. This suggested Kevin may have been brain dead for hours before Allison called 911. 4 weeks after Kevin's death, Kruger met with his mother, Alta. She told him that Kevin and Allison were having marital problems and were possibly about to separate. This reinforced Kruger's suspicions. He believed that Allison had lost control and beaten her husband to death, possibly with a blunt object such as a kettlebell, dumbbell, or baseball bat, and then staged the crime by dragging his body down the stairs. However, no weapon was ever recovered. Kruger theorized that it might have been hidden in the upstairs bedroom with Willow, a room he hadn't searched. The thought haunted him. Kruger admitted that he completely regretted not having searched that room on the morning of the 12th, and that the murder weapon could have been there on December 22, 2023. A warrant was issued for Allison's arrest. 3 days before Christmas, she arrived at the Allen County Jail with her parents and told the officers that she was Allison Davis and that she was there to turn herself in. She was handcuffed in front of them. Allison was charged with murder and held without bond. For the next 17 months, she remained in jail, able to see her family only during attorney visits through plexiglass. There were no video calls or regular visits, only waiting. From her cell, Allison told loved ones she couldn't sleep because she kept reliving that morning. She said she missed Kevin deeply and longed to hear him call her babe again. The prosecution believed their case was solid, but the defense saw things differently. On May 6, 2025, Allison Davis went on trial for murder. Chief Deputy Prosecutor Tissa Helge presented Dr. Bill Smoke as her key witness. Dr. Smoke, known for testifying in high-profile cases, including those of Derek Chauvin and Robert Feldman, was described as a police surgeon showing the jury CT scans of Kevin's skull. Dr. Smoke testified that Kevin had suffered multiple blows to various areas of his head. He concluded that Kevin had been beaten to death, not fallen down the stairs, and that a blunt object, possibly a kettlebell, weight, or baseball bat, had likely been used. The prosecution focused on Allison's calm tone during the 911 call, her inconsistent statements, and her behavior with paramedics. They argued that Kevin's body placement at the base of the stairs did not match a natural fall. Crime scene technician Timothy Garat testified that the blood found in the hallway and living room could not have come from a stair fall, stating that blood cannot turn a corner. Dr. Smock testified that Kevin's low body temperature showed he had been lying there for at least 2 hours before the 911 call. The prosecution claimed Allison had delayed the call to create her story and hide the weapon. The defense, led by attorneys Andrew Baldwin and Max Wiley, countered that there was no murder weapon, physical evidence, or motive. They argued Kevin had been legally intoxicated and fell down the steep stairs, hitting his head on the banister post. For support, they brought in Dr. Bisa Dragovic, a forensic neuropathologist specializing in brain injuries. Dr. Dragovic testified that Kevin suffered only one head impact when he hit the banister post. That single, powerful blow shattered his skull in multiple places, causing his brain to bounce inside his head as bone fragments acted like shrapnel. He also disputed the prosecution's interpretation of Kevin's low body temperature. According to Dr. Dragovic, the impact destroyed Kevin's hypothalamus, the part of the brain that regulates temperature, causing his body to cool abnormally. The low temperature, he said, was evidence of severe brain damage, not of the late emergency call. He explained that the absence of blood on the banister was due to Kevin's internal injuries. The bleeding occurred inside his head and exited only through his nose and mouth. Baldwin criticized the police investigation, pointing out that the crime scene was released the same day. Photos were taken 4 days later, and Allison's father was allowed to clean up blood. Friends described Kevin and Allison's marriage as happy. Jason said Kevin's joking text about his wife was just a joke. Wiley argued that Allison was not the kind of woman who would violently attack her husband. The jury never saw data from Allison's Garmin smartwatch, which the defense claimed supported her version of events. Judge Fran Gull ruled the data inadmissible after 6.5 hours of deliberation on May 9, 2025, around 11:00 p.m. The jury returned a verdict, not guilty. Allison Davis was acquitted of murder. Her father, Steve, watched as she broke down in tears of relief. though she remained in jail briefly for release processing at 2:12 a.m. On May 10, Allison walked out of jail to Cheers after spending 17 months behind bars. Her first meal as a free woman was wings and pizza. An anonymous juror said the reason they acquitted was because the prosecution had no convincing evidence, no weapon, no hard evidence, no way to determine how the crime happened. Dr. Dragovich's testimony helped them better understand Kevin's trauma. Without solid evidence, they couldn't convict Detective Kruger. Now the police chief was devastated. He said that he was 100% convinced Allison had murdered Kevin, adding that his biggest regret was not having searched the bedroom shared with Willow, where he believed the weapon might have been hidden. Kevin's mother, Alta Beers, showed grace, despite her grief. Alta took comfort knowing Kevin's organ donations saved 4 lives. Allison returned to her parents' home with Willow, choosing a quiet life as she tried to rebuild after losing her husband and spending 17 months in jail for a crime. The jury said she didn't commit. Kevin's death remains officially classified as a homicide. The case is still unsolved, and no one has been held accountable. In Norway's quiet political circles, few couples appeared more stable or respectable than diplomat Per Paust and his wife, Anne Orderud Paust, a high-ranking government official with access to the nation's most sensitive institutions. They were polished, influential, and widely trusted, but behind the calm facade of their professional lives, a threat was quietly closing in. When Anne returned to her family farm seeking refuge after her husband's sudden death, tragedy struck again. In a single night, 3 members of the Orderud family were executed in their sleep, and what looked at first like the work of a professional assassin would soon unravel into one of the most disturbing, tangled, and controversial criminal cases in Norway's modern history. Per Paust was born on December 1, 1943, in Norway. Always eloquent and quick-witted, it was no surprise that he pursued political science at university. After completing high school, he later became a Norwegian diplomat, serving as press secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and holding several other senior positions throughout his career. He was married to Anne Orderud Paust, born on April 3, 1952, who was also a well-known public figure in Norway and served as private secretary to the Minister of Defense. The couple lived a respected, successful life in Oslo, surrounded by political influence and responsibility. Around 3:30 a.m. on March 12, 1998, colleagues drove the couple home after an evening out. They had barely stepped out of the car when a stranger suddenly attacked Per. He grabbed Per by the tie, threw him to the ground, and began kicking him repeatedly. Anne rushed to help her husband, striking the assailant several times with her purse, but this only provoked him further. He turned on Anne and hit her hard across the head. She screamed for help. Several witnesses noticed the commotion. The friends who had driven them home saw the attack in their rearview mirror and returned to intervene. At that moment, the attacker abruptly stood up, turned around, and slowly walked away as if nothing had happened. He walked a short distance, then calmly circled back toward Per and Anne. But instead of attacking again, he merely walked past them, expressionless, before disappearing into the darkness. The entire encounter was strange and unsettling. When police arrived, multiple witnesses gave statements describing what they had seen. Despite their efforts, the attacker was never identified. His face had been concealed by the darkness. Investigators initially suspected robbery or retaliation linked to political disagreements. In time, Per and Anne recovered physically, but emotionally, they were forced to accept that the investigation had reached a dead end. About a year later, the attack had largely faded from public memory. On July 17, 1998, as the couple prepared to leave for work, Per got into his wife's car. As Anne approached from behind, she noticed something unusual beneath the rear wheel. She pulled out a black cylindrical tube, unsure of what it was, and brought it with her. Upon arriving at work with her husband, she immediately showed the item to a security guard. Although he was uncertain, he suspected it might be an explosive device. He urged them to contact the police, advice that proved critical. The bomb squad examined the object and confirmed it was a 500-gram stick of dynamite. Someone had affixed the explosive to their car. Anne and Per had no known personal conflicts, no apparent enemies who would want them dead. Detectives quickly suspected a connection to their professional roles, and a full investigation began. Police soon located a witness, the couple's neighbor. That morning, he had noticed a thin wire stretched across the street near the observation deck of the building where the couple lived. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but it was now clear the wire had been a Bickford fuse designed to ignite the explosive. Believing it to be litter, he had picked it up and thrown it away. That seemingly insignificant action had unknowingly saved the couple's lives. Investigators recovered the discarded fuse along with the explosive for analysis, but neither yielded any useful leads. While the police were still investigating the bomb, another frightening and inexplicable incident occurred on August 12, 1998. Late that night, Per woke up to use the bathroom. As soon as he sat up, he noticed an overwhelming smell of gas and gasoline. When he approached the front door, the odor grew stronger. He opened it and saw a large metal cylinder outside, its valve open and hissing. A tube ran from the cylinder directly into their apartment. Per immediately contacted the police. When officers arrived, the 5-liter gas cylinder was still standing outside the apartment door. Almost all of the gas had already escaped. The cylinder was soaked in gasoline, and a clear trail of it led all the way down to the street. It was obvious the device had been deliberately set up to flood their apartment with gas. For reasons that remain unknown, the attacker failed to ignite the gasoline and trigger an explosion, likely because Per had woken up, frightened him off. When police and firefighters entered the building, the air inside the apartment was so saturated with gas that even the smallest spark could have caused a catastrophic blast. Residents had to be evacuated immediately. Per and Anne were deeply shaken. They understood that someone wanted them dead. They were forced to stay with friends, while detectives and fire officials continued their investigation. The series of attempted attacks drew massive media attention, especially because the victims were high-profile government officials and the attempts appeared increasingly coordinated. Unfortunately, the case stalled. No fingerprints or traces were found on the cylinder, and once again, the perpetrator had managed to escape without leaving a single useful clue. Despite extensive police work, the investigation reached another dead end. While the case remained unsolved, Anne and Per received an offer to work in New York as consular officials. Both accepted enthusiastically and temporarily moved to the United States, hoping distance would shield them from the unknown threat looming over their lives in Norway. They considered the opportunity a much-needed escape. Living and working in Oslo had become far too dangerous. In January 1999, Anne and Per felt the situation had calmed and decided to return home. But any hope of a peaceful life in Norway quickly faded. Shortly after their return, Per was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Only a few months later, on May 6, 1999, he passed away. Grieving and emotionally exhausted, Anne was devastated. She did not want to abandon her professional responsibilities, but she needed time, rest, and the support of her family. She decided to stay at her parents' farm in Surum while she recovered, because the identity of the person who had targeted her and her husband was still unknown. She kept her plans secret, sharing them only with her closest family members. Anne's father, Christian Orderud, was 81 years old, and her mother, Marie Orderud, was 84. They lived on the Orderud family farm, a large property with several houses. Anne's brother, also named Per, lived in the main farmhouse, while their elderly parents lived in a smaller two-story house nearby. Anne planned to stay with them for a while as she tried to regain her strength. On May 23, 1999, Hans, Anne's uncle and Christian's brother, drove out to the farm to visit the family. The funeral for Anne's husband had taken place only a few days earlier. Hans wanted to offer his condolences and support. When he arrived, he walked up to the smaller house and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. It was a warm, sunny day, so he assumed they might have gone for a walk in the woods behind the home. But something felt off, so he circled to the back of the house to check. There, on the terrace, he noticed broken glass scattered near the rear entrance. Looking up, he saw the second-floor balcony door shattered. Alarmed, Hans entered the house. The door was unlocked. Inside, he found a horrific scene. 47-year-old Anne lay lifeless on the kitchen floor. In the living room, 84-year-old Marie had also been killed. In the bedroom, 81-year-old Christian was found dead as well. Hans immediately called the police. A triple murder investigation began at once. By the end of the day, detectives had reconstructed the basic outline of what had happened. Sometime between midnight and 5 o'clock a.m., unknown assailants had climbed up to the second-floor terrace, smashed the glass door, and entered the house. All three victims were in their pajamas. Investigators concluded that more than one perpetrator had carried out the killings because the victims were shot with two different calibers, .22 and .38. The attackers first entered the bedroom where Marie and Christian Orderud were sleeping. Christian was shot first with a .38 caliber round. Although seriously wounded, he did not die immediately. In a desperate attempt to protect his wife, he managed to reach for a shotgun stored in the wardrobe, but before he could use it, he was struck again by a .22 caliber bullet. He collapsed and died moments later. Marie also attempted to defend herself, but she was shot in the chest with a .38 caliber pistol. She did not die instantly. She tried to flee toward the living room, likely hoping to alert her daughter. There, she was shot again. Severely wounded, she collapsed onto the floor. Still alive, but rapidly losing blood, she slipped into unconsciousness and died within minutes. Anne, who likely woke to the sound of gunfire and screams, ran into the kitchen. She was immediately shot with a .38 caliber round. The injury was fatal, and she collapsed near the kitchen counter, dying instantly. Beyond these findings, investigators had very little to work with. The perpetrators left almost no physical evidence inside the house. Spent shells were recovered from both calibers, and a partial shoe print was found among the broken glass near the smashed door on the second-floor balcony. After processing the crime scene, forensic specialists expanded the search to the surrounding farmland. In the nearby woods, they discovered a heavily worn, yellow woolen sock. It appeared the killers had attempted to cover their shoes with knitted socks to avoid leaving identifiable prints. The thin heels of the socks tore quickly during movement. Part of one heel had detached and fallen off along the path. Since there were no other solid leads besides the shoe print, investigators began searching for shoes matching the pattern. They eventually located a store in the region that had sold two identical pairs in the relevant size. Unfortunately, the shopkeeper could not identify the buyer. At the same time, police began looking for possible witnesses. Their first priority was to question Per Christian Orderud and his wife, Veronica Orderud, who lived in the main farmhouse on the same property. Investigators believed they might have heard or seen something. Both appeared terrified. Per, especially, was visibly shaken by the brutal deaths of his parents and sister. The couple insisted they had no idea who could have done such a thing. The series of earlier attacks targeting Anne and her husband had deeply unsettled them as well. Per and Veronica provided little useful information. They claimed to have heard nothing that night. To investigators, this raised further questions. But considering the earlier use of explosives and gas, along with the likely use of silencers during the shooting, the attackers seemed meticulous and highly prepared. This would explain why the murders produced so little noise. The theory of a robbery gone wrong was dismissed almost immediately. Nothing had been stolen. The previous assassination attempts against Anne and Per also eliminated the possibility of coincidence. This was clearly a targeted attack driven by a personal motive. With that realization, the list of potential suspects narrowed significantly. The killers seemed familiar with the family's routines and circumstances. Very few people knew that Anne had quietly moved back to the farm after her husband's death. It was also likely not a coincidence that the attack occurred only days after she voluntarily withdrew her police protection. The lack of signs of a struggle suggests the victims didn't feel threatened by their attackers at first, indicating they likely knew each other. About 10 days after the triple murder, a witness contacted the police and reported that Veronica's sister, Kristin Kirkemo, had been acting unusually suspicious. According to the witness, Kristin frequently practiced shooting in a wooded area near her home. The claim raised immediate red flags. She was brought in for questioning. Her behavior at the police station only deepened the investigators' suspicions. She avoided direct answers, spoke vaguely, and seemed nervous. Police obtained a warrant to search her home. Kristin lived not far from the Orderud farm with her boyfriend, Lars Grønnerud. Both had a history of banned substances use and long-term dependency issues. Inside the house, police found a substantial quantity of explosives, tools commonly used to manufacture explosive devices, and several firearms, including a .22 caliber weapon. Because one of the calibers used in the murders was .22, the firearm was immediately sent for ballistic testing. The results, however, did not match the weapon to the killings. Yet, the ammunition seized from their home matched the type of cartridges found at the crime scene, giving detectives reason to believe they were still following the right trail. Kristin's boyfriend, Lars, was also questioned. He confirmed owning a .38 caliber weapon, while Kristin had used the .22 caliber one during shooting practice. They claimed they were simply hunting enthusiasts who enjoyed target shooting. Despite these suspicious coincidences, investigators initially focused more attention on Anne Orderud Paust and her brother, Per Christian Orderud. Anne and Per Christian Orderud had been close since childhood. Both grew up on the Orderud family's land, but their lives diverged as adults and chose a different path. She attended university, completed her education, and entered political service. Her parents continued managing the family farm, but as Christian grew older, his health declined. He struggled to maintain the demanding workload. Around the time Per turned 30, Christian and Marie retired from active farm work and handed over management to Per Christian Orderud. Anne still had no interest in farm life, but retained her legal share of the inheritance. Nearly a decade later, when Per was about 40, a 21-year-old veterinary assistant named Veronica began working on the property. Despite the significant age difference, she and Per quickly became romantically involved, after which she moved into the main house. Tensions surfaced in 1997. Christian objected strongly to Veronica living in the primary residence. Around the same time, the farm's accountant discovered that Per had registered himself as the owner, even though he had never completed the agreed-upon payment to his father. Christian was furious. and considered hiring a lawyer to renegotiate the terms, insisting his son had failed to honor their original contract. When Per learned of his father's intentions, he retaliated by filing a legal complaint. The conflict escalated dramatically. Father and son stopped speaking for an entire year. Instead of seeking reconciliation, Per sued his father, arguing that the written agreement proving the sale price was legally binding. He initially won the case, but Christian countered by filing an appeal, claiming his signature had been forged. The appellate court accepted his argument. The earlier ruling was overturned. Detectives noted that as the daughter, Anne would be the primary heir to the family farm if her parents died. Christian had reportedly been dissatisfied with Per's management of the farm and concerned about the loans Per had taken out, fearing they might jeopardize the estate's long-term financial stability. With these family conflicts now exposed, Per and Veronica quickly became prime suspects, but they weren't alone. Once investigators discovered that Kristin and Lars owned firearms compatible with those used in the killings, they too were added to the list. Per and Veronica denied owning any guns and insisted they were not involved. They claimed that on the night of the murders, they were asleep in the main farmhouse, had heard nothing unusual, but their alibi was weak. No one else could verify it. Moreover, given the close distance between the houses, their claim that they heard nothing raised serious doubts. Even with silencers, the breaking of glass, the forced entry, and the victim's screams should have been audible, especially in the quiet countryside at night. Their silence only intensified investigators' suspicion. All four suspects attended the funeral, but even cried, drawing attention from those present. Gradually, under increasing pressure from investigators, Kristin Kirkemo and Lars Grønnerød began to crack. They admitted that they had supplied Veronica and Per with the weapons and had helped plan the triple murder. Lars was noticeably less cooperative. He confirmed that he had given a weapon to Kristin, but insisted that he knew nothing about their intentions. He claimed he had been at home on the night of the murders, and his alibi was verified. However, he could not confirm Kristin's whereabouts. At first, Kristin was released due to a lack of solid evidence linking her directly to the killings. She denied participating in the shootings at the farm. Soon after, she returned to the police station and presented an alibi, claiming that she and a friend had spent the night delivering packages around the city. She even provided mobile phone records as proof. Digital analysis seemed to support her account. But when detectives questioned the friend, the truth quickly unraveled. The friend admitted she had not been with Kristin that night. Kristin had simply borrowed her phone and passed the activity off as her own. Once this lie was exposed, the police had enough grounds to arrest the entire group. All four suspects, Per, Veronica, Kristin, and Lars, were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and accessory to murder. 6 months passed as the investigation continued, with the primary objective of locating the firearm used in the triple homicide. During this time, the suspects remained in custody, but they suddenly recanted their earlier statements and sought release. Each suspect gave conflicting confessions throughout the interrogations. Per alone was questioned at least 17 times, and although his story shifted slightly each time, he appeared more consistent than the others. The suspects lied repeatedly, but they had coordinated their stories beforehand, so their versions overlapped in convenient ways. The murder weapon still had not been found. When Lars admitted he had sold one of the firearms, he offered almost no details about the buyer, claiming he didn't know the person. It was too little information to trace the weapon. However, he did provide one crucial piece of information. He said that Kristin had practiced shooting with that gun. He even showed detectives the exact place where she used to hang targets from a tree. At the scene, police recovered .38 caliber shell casings and several bullets embedded in the tree trunk. Ballistic analysis confirmed that these bullets were identical to those removed from the victims' bodies. This allowed investigators to link the weapon to the suspects even without ever recovering the gun itself. However, this alone could not determine who had pulled the trigger on the night of the murders. The media covered the high-profile case relentlessly, sparking a flood of theories, one of the most popular being that the murders were connected to organized crime. Many believed that Anne Orderud Paust was the primary target because of her political role. Earlier assassination attempts on her and her husband seemed to support the theory, and her parents may have been killed simply for being witnesses. The constant media attention also triggered a wave of false reports from citizens seeking publicity, yet some tips had elements of truth. During the investigation, a woman working at a senator's office contacted police, stating that on May 15th, an anonymous caller had warned her that an attack was being planned on Anne. That same day, her colleague also contacted authorities about the call. Investigators attempted to trace it but failed. When this information became public, many became even more convinced that the murders were politically motivated. After all, how could the police fail to protect a high-profile government official who had already survived multiple attacks? Investigators also examined whether the suspects had been involved in the previous assassination attempts targeting Anne and her husband. They soon discovered that the explosives found in Lars and Kristin's home were identical to the dynamite planted under Anne's car the previous year. All of the materials, dynamite, Bickford fuses, and black tubes, had been obtained by Lars. The question of motive came up again and again throughout the investigation. While Per Christian Orderud's motive was considered strong, centered on inheritance, ownership of the farm, and financial gain, the involvement of Veronica Orderud, Kristin Kirkemo, Lars Grenerud was more difficult to understand. Although all three might have been tempted by money, investigators found no significant transfers, withdrawals, or bank movements that suggested a direct financial reward. Eventually, however, another picture began to form. After gaining full ownership of the Orderud farm, Per and Veronica planned to divide the large property into smaller plots, which they intended to sell individually to developers and private buyers. Veronica later admitted that Per had attracted her with promises of wealth, but neither Per nor Veronica possessed the experience or the weapons needed to carry out such a crime. That was when Veronica approached her sister Kristin and Kristin's boyfriend, Lars. She knew about their addiction issues and believed they would not refuse an offer that involved easy money. This suspicion was later confirmed when detectives found Veronica's diary, which contained harsh remarks about Christian and Marie. In it, she described Per's legal battles with his father and repeatedly expressed her wish that the elderly couple would disappear. Another motive soon emerged, one tied not to property or wealth, but to family. Kristin had given birth to a son several years earlier, but due to her banned substances use, she lost custody. Her sister Veronica quickly secured guardianship of the boy. As the official guardian, Veronica had strict responsibilities and could not allow Kristin unsupervised access. Kristin was only able to see her child when she visited the Orderud farm, but Anne's plan to sell her share of the farm threatened to unravel everything. It put both the family home and Per's expected profit at risk. For Kristin, it also threatened her only opportunity to see her son. Fearing that she would lose even this limited access, Kristin became deeply involved in the conspiracy and dragged Lars into it as well. When these elements finally came to light, the case moved rapidly towards sentencing. On June 22, 2001, Veronica Orderud and Kristin Kirkemo were found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 21 years in prison. The maximum penalty in Norway, Lars Grenerud was convicted of illegal possession of a firearm and given 2.5 years, though prosecutors appealed, and his sentence was later increased to 18 years. During the appeals process, Kristen's sentence was reduced to 16 years, largely because the court could not determine conclusively who fired the fatal shots and who served primarily as accomplices in planning the murders. All 4 defendants have since completed their sentences and been released. Veronica was granted parole after serving 2/3 of her term. More than 14 years later, she continues to deny any involvement, giving occasional interviews in which she maintains her innocence. Although she divorced Per long ago, she still keeps in contact with him and visits the graves of the murdered Orderud family. Despite the convictions, some people remain unconvinced of their guilt. To many, the alleged motive, property disputes, inheritance, and family tension seem too convoluted to justify the killing of an entire household. Others argued that the earlier assassination attempts on Anne Orderud Paust and her husband pointed to a more powerful enemy. Some continued to believe that the murders were orchestrated by organized crime. Private investigator Tor Sandberg publicly suggested in 2009 that the Balkan Mafia may have been involved, citing the unusually rapid death of Anne's husband, which he believed resembled poisoning more than cancer. However, Norwegian police have consistently rejected these theories, continuing to insist that Per, Veronica, Kristen, and Lars were responsible for the murders.